Nadia Okafor had a habit that her mother found both amusing and exhausting. Every evening after dinner, she would sit at the small wooden desk near her bedroom window and write in a notebook with a dark blue cover. Not poetry, not a diary, exactly. A list, the same list, refined and updated, re-examined like a document under revision. She had been keeping it since she was 19 years old, and now at 22, she knew every word of it by memory, the way other people memorized prayers. The man she would one day choose had to be tall, not unreasonably so, but tall enough that she felt small beside him, without feeling invisible. He had to be educated, properly educated, not just holding a certificate from some institution that handed out degrees the way shops gave loyalty cards. He had to come from a family with a name that carried weight, the kind of name that when spoken in a room, caused people to turn their heads slightly, not out of gossip, but out of respect. He had to be handsome in a way that was effortless rather than manufactured. He had to understand literature and speak about it without showing off. He had to be generous without being showy. He had to love his mother without being controlled by her, and he had to look at Nadia as though she were the most interesting person in any room she entered, not because she was performing for him, but because she genuinely was. She did not think this was asking too much. Her mother, Gloria Okafor, thought otherwise, but she had learned over the years that saying so out loud produced more trouble than silence. Gloria was a small, composed woman who wore her gray hair in a neat bun and carried herself with the dignity of someone who had worked very hard for everything she owned and wanted no one to forget it. She had raised Nadia alone after Nadia's father, Patrick, passed when Nadia was 11, a sudden illness that took him in 3 weeks and left Gloria with a mortgage, 2 other younger children, and a grief she kept very organized, the way she kept everything else. She had managed it all with a firmness that Nadia had inherited, though on Nadia it wore a different shape. On Gloria it was practicality. On Nadia it was standards. The family lived in a good part of Coventry, in a terraced house with a garden at the back that Gloria filled with roses every summer. It was not a wealthy neighborhood by any definition, but it was a clean and quiet one, and Gloria had arranged her small life inside it with great care. Nadia had grown up understanding that things worth having required patience and discipline. She had applied this lesson to her education. She studied hard, graduated near the top of her class, read constantly, spoke carefully. She had been told since childhood that she was special. Her teachers said it. Relatives said it. Her father, before he died, had told her once, while she sat on his lap reading a picture book, that she was going to do things most people only read about. She believed him. She had never stopped believing him. What this did to a young woman, over time, was a thing nobody around her was yet able to measure. It settled inside her the way sediment settles at the bottom of a glass, slowly, invisibly, until one day you pick up the glass and realize the water no longer looks quite clear. Nadia was not arrogant in the open, showy way that made people dislike you immediately. She was warm in conversation. She laughed easily and genuinely. She remembered details about people, birthdays, the names of their parents, the jobs they had lost, the things they worried about. People left conversations with Nadia, feeling that they had been truly seen. But inside, quietly and without apology, she had decided that she deserved the best. She had graduated from the University of Warwick the previous summer with a degree in English literature, something her Aunt Dorothy had questioned loudly at the graduation dinner, and which Nadia had defended with such calm precision that Dorothy had changed the subject. The degree had led to a position at a publishing company in Birmingham, a 40-minute train ride each morning, where she worked as an editorial assistant and spent her days reading manuscripts and writing polite but firm rejection letters. She was good at the job. She was good at most things she turned her attention to, and she knew this, and it made the list in the blue notebook feel even more reasonable. She was not looking for a perfect man. She was clear about that, at least in her own mind. She was looking for the right man, and the list was simply a way of being honest with herself about what right meant. She had watched too many of her friends settle, watched them choose men who were available rather than suitable, men who were kind enough or present enough, or simply there enough, and she had watched those relationships with a quiet, private sadness, not superiority. She would not have said it was superiority. She would have said it was concern. She did not want to make the same mistake. She did not want to be 50 and realize she had traded her real life for a comfortable one. Her closest friend, a woman named Claire Whitmore who had studied law and now worked at a firm in London, had gotten engaged the previous December to a man named Paul, a financial planner from Leicester, who wore sensible shoes and made good money, and was, by all accounts, a reliable and decent person. Claire was happy. She seemed genuinely, radiantly happy, and Nadia had attended the engagement dinner and smiled all evening and meant the smile. But on the train home she had sat with her coat folded on her lap and looked out at the dark countryside passing the window and thought, "I am not ready to want that." She did not yet know what she meant by that sentence. She thought she did, but she did not. The first proposal came that spring, from a man named George Barton. George was the son of a fairly well-known barrister in London, 28 years old, solidly built, with a pleasant face and an accent that suggested good schooling. He had met Nadia at a mutual friend's dinner party in March, and he had called her the following week, and they had been on 3 dates before his mother, who was apparently very involved in these matters, arranged a meeting at the family home. Nadia went. The house was impressive in the way that old money tends to be. Not flashy, but layered. Heavy curtains, a fireplace with an actual fire in it, silver frames holding photographs of people at events Nadia did not recognize but understood to be important. George's mother, a woman named Helen Barton, served tea with the manner of someone who had decided before you arrived whether she approved of you. Nadia noted all of this calmly and sat with straight posture and answered every question with an ease that she could tell impressed Helen, even as it made George visibly nervous. After the visit, George called her. He was direct and a little formal, as though he had rehearsed the words. He said he liked her very much and would like to think about a future with her, if she felt the same way. Nadia considered him for several days. She thought about his face, which was pleasant, but not the face she had imagined. She thought about the dinner parties, which were comfortable, but not exciting. She thought about his laugh, which was fine, but did not do anything to her. She thought about the way he had deferred to his mother during the visit, not rudely, not weakly, but in a way that suggested a pattern she could project forward into 20 years of Christmases and family decisions. She told him, gently, that she did not feel a strong enough connection. George thanked her politely. She appreciated that. She also felt nothing in particular as she put down the phone, which she took as confirmation that she had made the right choice. She told Claire about it on a Saturday morning call while making coffee, and Claire listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Nadia valued most about her. "He sounds perfectly decent," Claire said, when Nadia had finished. "He was," Nadia agreed. "But not right." "No." There was a pause on the line, and Nadia could hear the faint sound of Paul moving around in Claire's flat in the background, the particular domestic noise of someone comfortable in a space, and she wondered briefly if Claire was thinking what Nadia thought she might be thinking. But Claire only said, "Okay then," with the kind of warmth that held no judgment, and they moved on to talking about other things. The second proposal came 4 months later, from a man named Adrian Cole, and was a more complicated experience. Adrian was the kind of man who entered a room and immediately rearranged it, not physically, but atmospherically. He was 31, very well educated, a doctorate in economics from Oxford, which he mentioned the first time they met, but did not belabor, and he ran a small consultancy that was, from what Nadia could gather, doing quite well. He was handsome, not pleasant handsome like George, actually handsome, the kind that made women nearby find reasons to continue a conversation. He was quick and funny in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. He dressed well without being fussy about it. He read, actually read, not just had bookshelves. And when he found out about Nadia's work in publishing, he asked her questions about it that demonstrated real curiosity. He also had, she noticed within the first month, an opinion about everything and a compulsion to share it. This was not in itself a flaw. Nadia had opinions too, and she valued people who stood behind their ideas. But Adrian's opinions arrived in a particular shape. Confident to the point where confidence became assumption, animated to the point where animation became performance. He liked being the most interesting person speaking, and he was usually able to sustain this without too much effort, which meant he had never really had to develop the companion skill of listening. Nadia listened beautifully. She had been told this. It was, she knew, part of why people found her so compelling. She gave her full attention, without the distraction of waiting for her turn to speak. She asked questions that made people feel understood, With Adrian, she found she was doing this constantly, absorbing, responding, drawing out, while he gave back just enough to make it feel like a conversation, without it ever quite becoming one. She noticed this. She filed it away without announcing it. His family was everything the list might have asked for. Old name, old money, a grandfather who had built something, a father who had kept it, Adrian who had taken the inheritance and added to it, rather than reducing it. His mother, when Nadia met her, was charming in the thin, precise way of women who have always had exactly what they wanted. She looked Nadia over with an approval that was not entirely comfortable to receive, as though Nadia were something that might fit nicely in the house, rather than someone who might one day enter it as an equal. Nadia noticed that too. Adrian proposed on a Sunday evening in November, at a restaurant she had mentioned once in passing as a place she had always wanted to try. He had booked it, she realized, from memory. He had been listening, at least then. He had a ring, tasteful, not excessive, the right instinct if not quite the right stone. And he delivered the proposal with the confidence of a man who rarely expected to be refused. She did not refuse him that night. She asked for time. She took 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, she went through the list with the seriousness of a surgeon reviewing scans. She wrote his name in the notebook, and beside it, wrote every quality she could honestly say he had. The list was long. On paper, he was close to ideal. Closer than George. Closer than the men before George. The casual ones, who hadn't made it to the list at all. She stared at the page for a long time. What she could not write down, because she could not fully name it yet, was the feeling she got when she imagined 50 years of being slightly less than fully heard. The feeling of being in a room with someone who filled it so completely that she would have to be very careful, always, not to disappear. She was not prepared to be careful about disappearing. She had worked too hard to be visible. She told Adrian no. He was not graceful about it, not cruel. He did not say anything unkind, but the confidence that had seemed attractive in the restaurant became something else on the other end of a refusal. He said he didn't understand. He said he had thought they were building towards something. He said, with the careful restraint of someone who had been told their whole life that they were exceptional, that he had thought she felt the same way. She said she was sorry. She meant it. He did not call again. She had not expected him to. Her mother found out about the Adrian situation 2 days later, in the way that mothers always find things out. She did not scold Nadia. She sat across from her at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea she did not drink, and looked at her daughter, with an expression that contained many things at once. Love, worry, patience fraying at its edges, and said, simply, "One day you are going to have to decide what you are actually looking for, Nadia." Nadia smiled the way she always smiled at her mother when this subject came up, which was warmly and a little firmly, and said, "I know exactly what I am looking for." Gloria looked at her tea. She did not say another word. Outside, the garden roses had finished for the year. The stems were bare and a little sharp in the gray October light, and they looked nothing like they did in summer, and yet they were the same roses. Nobody mentioned that. The winter that followed was a quiet one. Nadia worked long days at the publishing house, reading manuscripts that ranged from brilliant to barely coherent, writing her notes in the margins with a red pen she refilled 3 times a year. She made friends at work, a woman named Sophie Marsh who was funny and slightly chaotic, and brought homemade biscuits every Friday that were never quite as good as she believed them to be, and a man named Daniel, who was quietly talented and almost never talked about himself. She liked them both. She liked the rhythm of the office, the sense of things being made, of stories moving from one state to another under careful hands. She did not meet anyone who made her revise the notebook. In February, her mother's sister Dorothy came to visit for a weekend, and on the Saturday evening, Dorothy opened a bottle of wine and began, with the enthusiasm of someone who had clearly been rehearsing, to tell Nadia about the son of a family friend named Lawrence Webb. Lawrence was 29, apparently, a dentist, thriving practice, nice house in Solihull. He attended church, which Dorothy mentioned with the particular emphasis of someone who believed this resolved multiple questions at once. He was, Dorothy said, looking for a serious relationship with the right woman. Nadia listened to all of this and asked several questions, partly out of genuine curiosity, and partly because she had learned that asking questions was a more graceful response than saying no immediately. She asked about his education beyond dentistry. Dorothy was not sure. She asked about his interests. Dorothy mentioned golf and cooking, in that order. She asked, carefully, whether he was the kind of man who thought deeply about things, or the kind who preferred to keep life simple. Dorothy set down her glass. Not every man needs to write philosophy, Nadia. I know that, Nadia said, without any edge at all. She met Lawrence the following month, for coffee, in a place neither of them had chosen. Dorothy had picked it, apparently, which said something about the nature of the whole arrangement. Lawrence was perfectly nice. He was well-groomed, and he smelled of something clean, and he held the door open without making a theatrical thing of it. He asked about her work, and appeared to find it interesting, or at least he did a good job of appearing to. He was not unhandsome. He had kind eyes. He told a joke about a patient that was actually quite funny, and she laughed genuinely. She did not feel anything else. She told Dorothy afterward that Lawrence was a wonderful person who deserved someone who was right for him, and she, Nadia, was not that person, and she said this with such gentle certainty that Dorothy could only exhale and say, "You are going to be very lonely one day, child." Nadia drove home with the radio off and the window slightly open despite the cold. She thought about lonely. She turned the word over in her mind, the way you turn a stone in your hand, examining it. She thought, there is a difference between being alone and being lonely. She thought, I am not lonely. I have work and friends, and a city I am learning to love, and a notebook with a list that makes sense. She thought these things all the way home. She did not think about Lawrence again, except once, some weeks later, when Dorothy mentioned at a family call that he had started seeing someone, a teacher, apparently. Dorothy said this with the weight of a point being made. Nadia said that was wonderful, and she hoped he was happy. She meant both things. The spring brought a promotion at work. She was moved from editorial assistant to a junior editor position, which meant she now made actual decisions about actual manuscripts rather than simply feeding notes upward. She was 22 going on 23, which was young for the role, and she knew it, and it pleased her without making her feel the need to mention it. She worked harder. She read faster. She found, to her own surprise, that she had very strong instincts about what made a story work and what made it fall apart. And her instincts were usually right, and people in the office started to notice. This was the version of herself she believed in most, the professional version, the capable version, the woman who sat in meetings and said things that made people write them down. This version did not require anyone else's participation. It was entirely hers. The man from the list, she told herself, would come eventually. He would arrive in the way good things arrived, not because you chased them, but because you were exactly where you were supposed to be when they appeared. She was patient. She was, she believed, very patient. What she did not understand yet, and would not begin to understand for quite some time, was that the list in the notebook was not a map to what she wanted. It was a set of walls built in very specific directions, and she was living inside them with such comfort that she had never thought to look at what they were keeping out. The summer, Nadia turned 23. Brought heat that sat over the city like something that had decided to stay. The office where she worked had air conditioning that could not make up its mind, cycling between too cold and barely functional, and by July, she had taken to keeping a cardigan on her chair and a small fan on her desk that her colleague Sophie had given her as a birthday gift, with a card that read, "For the woman who is always right, even about temperature." She had been a junior editor for 4 months by then, and she was good at it in ways that were beginning to be talked about. She had saved a manuscript in March that everyone had been ready to let go, a debut novel by a writer named Frances who was, by her own admission, a nervous wreck about the whole process, and Nadia had seen something in it that the others had missed, a quality of voice buried under structural problems that could be fixed. She had worked with Frances through 2 revisions, with a patience that did not feel like effort, because the work genuinely interested her. The book had been acquired, and Frances had cried on the phone, and Nadia had sat at her desk afterward with a feeling in her chest that she could not quite name, but that was something like rightness, like being exactly where a thing was supposed to be. It was in that summer that she met William Farrow. She met him at a reading in a bookshop in Birmingham, one of those evenings that began with a talk by an author she admired, and ended with everyone standing around holding glasses of wine and talking in that particular warm, blurry way people do when books and wine have made them feel generous toward each other. William was tall, which she noticed immediately, because she always noticed. He was wearing a dark jacket, and he was holding his wine glass by the stem, rather than the bowl, which struck her as a small piece of evidence about a person that she filed away, without quite knowing why. He was talking to someone she did not know, and he was listening to that person. Actually listening, she could tell. The way you can always tell when someone is performing attention versus giving it. And when the conversation reached a natural pause, he looked up and across the room, and their eyes met for a moment that was slightly longer than accidental. He came across the room 20 minutes later. He said, "You look like someone who came for the author and stayed despite the wine." She laughed. "The wine is fine." That's a very diplomatic answer. "I work in publishing. It's an occupational skill." His name was William. He was 30, an architect by profession, and a person who read widely by habit. He had grown up in Bristol, studied in Edinburgh, ended up in Birmingham for a project that had become two projects that had become, apparently, a life. He was clever in a way that did not announce itself first thing. It came out over the course of a conversation, in the connections he made between things, in the questions he asked that arrived slightly sideways to where you expected them to land. He asked about her work with genuine curiosity, and then said, without any preamble, "What's the last book that actually changed something in you? Not the last good book, the last one that rearranged something." She thought about it seriously, which she appreciated in herself, because the question deserved seriousness. She named a novel she had read the previous winter, explained what it had done to her understanding of grief, not performed grief, the real interior kind. And as she talked, she watched him listening, and he was doing it properly, the way she did it, the full attention thing, and she felt something that she was careful not to examine too closely right then. They talked for an hour and a half. The bookshop was emptying around them, and neither of them moved. At the end, he asked if she would want to have dinner sometime, and she said yes without consulting anything internal, which was not something she usually did. They had dinner the following Thursday, then the Thursday after that. Then on a Saturday they went to a gallery and argued, enjoyably, about a painting that neither of them fully understood, but both had strong feelings about. She noticed, with the careful attention she paid to everything, that he was easy to be with in the specific way that mattered most to her, not easy like comfortable furniture, but easy like a conversation that did not require maintenance. She did not have to manage him. She did not have to adjust her frequency. She could say exactly what she thought, and he responded to exactly that, not to a softened version of it, and this was rarer than she had expected it to be. She liked him. She was certain of this by week 3. By week 5, she found herself thinking about him on the train home, in a way that was different from how she had thought about George or Adrian or Lawrence. It was not the checklist evaluation thinking she usually did. It was a lighter kind of thinking, the kind where you replay a sentence someone said, and it still makes you smile, or you notice something in a shop window and think, he would have a funny thing to say about that. She told Claire about him on a Sunday morning call, and Claire, who had by now been engaged for 8 months and was in the deep, sometimes frantic trenches of planning a wedding, went quiet in the way she did when something mattered. "He sounds like someone real," Claire said. "What does that mean?" "It means he sounds like an actual person, rather than a checklist item." There was a warmth in Claire's voice, and not the slightest edge. Nadia said, "I don't use a checklist." Claire said, "Of course," very gently, and moved on. They had been seeing each other for 2 months, when William mentioned, one evening over dinner, that his mother was ill. He said it in the way men sometimes say difficult things, quickly, between other sentences, as though they hope the speed will reduce the weight of it. His mother had been diagnosed in the spring with a condition that required careful management and periodic hospital stays, and he was, he said, trying to figure out what that meant for his life going forward. He might need to spend more time in Bristol. He might eventually need to consider moving back. Nadia listened. She asked the right questions. She reached across the table and touched his hand, and he looked at her hand on his, with an expression she could not read fully, but that felt like gratitude, and something beyond gratitude. She thought about this on the train home. She thought about Bristol, which was 2 hours away. She thought about a life where someone's primary obligation was elsewhere, where the future required constant negotiation with geography and family need. She thought about the list. She had never written anything on the list about a man whose life was complicated in the way that real lives get complicated: illness, family, responsibility. The list was a document about perfection, and perfection, she was beginning to dimly sense, did not contain a category for things that were hard. She saw William 3 more times over the following month. Each evening was good. Each evening left her on the train home with the warm, slightly unsettled feeling of something she could not quite organize. He was kind, in a way that was not performance. He made her feel considered in a way she had not expected to feel. When he said her name in conversation, it had a quality she could not describe. She ended it on a Tuesday afternoon, by phone, before she had let it get further. She told him that she valued what they had built over the months, and that she thought he was exceptional, and that was true. She meant it, but she was worried that the circumstances of his life, the potential move, the family obligations, made it difficult to see a clear path forward, and she thought it was better to be honest about that now rather than wait. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know, I thought we were building the path as we went." She did not know what to say to that. She said she was sorry. She said she hoped he understood. He said he did. His voice was careful and a little tired, and she got off the phone and sat for a long time at her desk, without turning the lamp on, as the room got darker around her. She told herself she had been practical. She told herself that emotion was not a plan, that feeling something was not the same as building something, that a relationship needed foundations she could see, and she could not see his. She did not open the blue notebook that night. The summer moved on. She went to Claire's wedding in September, a lovely affair at a venue outside Bath, and she wore a deep green dress and drank champagne and danced with Claire's cousin Henry, who was cheerful and harmless, and she toasted the couple with a genuine heart, because she genuinely loved Claire and she genuinely believed in Claire's happiness. On the drive back, alone in a hired car, as the motorway rolled dark and straight ahead of her, she thought about William for the first time in weeks. She thought about him saying, "I thought we were building the path as we went." She turned the radio up and thought about something else. Sophie, at work, had started seeing someone, a teacher named Callum who was, by all Sophie's accounts, ordinary in most respects, but who made her laugh every single day, which Sophie said with a conviction that made Nadia look at her carefully. Sophie was not a complicated person. Sophie valued the biscuits on Friday and the laugh every day, and Callum, who was ordinary but warm, and she seemed, when she talked about him, to be in possession of something that Nadia could not quite name from where she was standing. One afternoon in October, Nadia was reading a manuscript that had come in that morning, a novel about 2 people who meet in a city neither of them belongs to, and she stopped on a sentence she read 3 times without moving. The sentence said, she had spent so long deciding what love should look like that she had forgotten to notice what it felt like when it was already in the room. She set the manuscript down. She sat for a while with that sentence in the air. Then she picked up her red pen and wrote in the margin, "True. But is the character aware of this, or does she only learn it later?" She went back to work. She did not think about William again that day. But the sentence stayed in her, the way certain things do, lodged in a corner of your mind where you have not specifically put them, waiting there patiently while you move on with everything else. The year turned, and with it came a new set of manuscripts, a new set of mornings on the train, a new set of evenings in the house she now rented by herself, in a part of the city she liked, for its small independent shops and its particular quality of light in the afternoons. She had moved out of her mother's house the previous spring, a step Gloria had accepted with a mix of pride and concern that she expressed by stocking Nadia's kitchen when she visited, and saying very little about anything else. Gloria had, by this point, learned which conversations to let lie. January brought a man named Patrick Holt, introduced at a dinner by a work contact named Ruth who meant very well. Patrick was a barrister, 32, self-assured in the specific way of people who spend their days constructing arguments and winning them. He was presentable. His family was established. He talked about his work with the enthusiasm of someone who had not yet gotten tired of hearing themselves, and he expressed an interest in Nadia's work that she recognized, from practice, as surface level, without being dishonest. He was a man who knew the forms of genuine engagement without always having the content beneath them. She had dinner with him twice. The second dinner was better than the first, and she thought for several days afterward about whether better was enough. She decided it was not, which was true, though she also understood somewhere beneath the decision that the real problem with Patrick was not what he was, but what he was not. She could not name what he was not. She set the thought aside. February brought nothing, which was fine, because she was deep in the revision of Frances's second novel, and the work was demanding in a way she found satisfying, rather than draining. Frances was a more confident writer now, though she still called Nadia at inopportune moments, with questions that were half editorial and half existential, and Nadia answered them all with a patience that her colleagues sometimes found remarkable, and that she found simply natural. March brought a conference in London, 3 days of panels and book launches, and late evenings in hotel bars, where the industry gathered to congratulate itself, and make deals, and eat canapés that were never quite filling. She stayed at a hotel near the venue, and walked to the events each morning, through streets that were cold and busy with purpose. She enjoyed the conference. She was good at the events, good at talking, good at listening, good at being in rooms. She was starting to be recognized, which was a small and pleasant thing. On the second evening she was introduced, at a launch party, to a man named Robert Gray. The introduction was made by her editor-in-chief, Helen, with the particular pointed warmth of someone who believed they were doing two people a favor. Robert was the son of a family Helen knew, and he was, Helen said, drawing Nadia aside for a moment before introducing them, exactly your kind of person. Robert was 33. He had an English literature degree from Cambridge, which was the first thing Helen mentioned. The way you mention credentials you believe will land well. He was now working in arts funding, which Nadia thought she might find interesting. He was quietly handsome, not the stop-you-in-the-street kind, but the kind that accumulated over time, and he shook her hand when they met with a grip that was confident, without being aggressive. He asked about her work with questions that demonstrated he had done at least some reading about what she did, which she appreciated. They talked for 40 minutes. He was intelligent. He knew the books she referenced. He made 2 observations about the publishing industry that she found genuinely acute, not just polished, and she raised an eyebrow at the second one, and he noticed and said, "What?" with a half smile, and she said, "That's actually quite right," and he said, "Don't sound so surprised." She laughed. She gave him her number before she left the party. He texted her 3 days after she returned to Birmingham. Not too soon, not so delayed it seemed calculated. The text said, "This is Robert from the launch, the one who surprised you about publishing. I'd like to have dinner if you're interested." She read it twice. She replied that she was interested. The dinner was a week later, at a restaurant in London she had been to once before and liked. Robert arrived exactly on time, which she noted. He had looked at the menu before choosing, which she also noted. He ordered wine, without making a production of the choosing, which she appreciated. He asked her, early in the conversation, what she thought about things, not just her job, but things in the wider sense, the kind of question that was either a genuine invitation or a test, and with Robert she found, as the evening went on, that it was a genuine invitation. He listened when she answered. He pushed back, occasionally, in ways that were thoughtful rather than combative. He told her about a project he had been involved in at his organization that had gone wrong, told it honestly, including his own mistakes, and she found that honesty arresting, because it was rarer than it should have been. By the end of the evening she had the feeling, for only the 3rd time in the years since the list had existed, that she might be sitting across from someone worth reconsidering. She drove home on the train thinking about him carefully, which was different from the light thinking she had done about William. This was measurement. She was holding him up against the list, not to find fault, but to find fit. He was tall. He was educated, properly and seriously educated. His family was respected. He was not showy handsome, but he was not without appeal. He was literate in a way that was bone deep, rather than acquired for effect. He was, from what she had seen, a man who took responsibility for himself. He had listened, genuinely, with the full attention quality she prized. He had not tried to impress her beyond what was natural to him, which was perhaps the most impressive thing of all. She opened the notebook that night for the first time in months. She did not write his name. She simply looked at the list, read it from top to bottom, and sat for a while with the thought that for the first time in a long time, The list and a real human being were not entirely separate documents. She was not ready to say more than that. But she noticed the feeling. She noticed it very carefully, and for once, she did not immediately try to organize it. Was perk. Robert Gray moved through the next 3 months of Nadia's life with a steadiness that she found difficult to argue with. He called when he said he would call. He remembered things she mentioned in passing, the author she was excited about, the neighborhood she was thinking of exploring, the childhood memory she shared once over dinner that was not dramatic but was real, and he brought them back up in later conversations in a way that was not calculated but felt natural, the way you mention something to a person you have been genuinely paying attention to. He made time for her without making it feel like an appointment. He had a life that existed independently of her, which she valued, because she did not want to be someone's entire world any more than she wanted someone to be hers. They were two self-contained people, choosing to spend time together, and that felt right to her. He came to Birmingham twice to see her, and the second time she took him to the bookshop where she had first met William, a thought she had as they walked through the door, quick and slightly uncomfortable, which she moved past without examining. She showed him the section she always headed to first, and he browsed it with his hands in his jacket pockets and pulled books off the shelf and read the first pages the way readers do, with the particular attentiveness of someone for whom first pages matter. He bought 3 books and she bought 1, and they had coffee at the cafe on the ground floor and talked for an hour in the unforced way of people who are genuinely interested in each other. She thought, sitting across from him in that cafe, that this was what she had been waiting for. Not the fireworks that people in romantic stories described. She had always been suspicious of fireworks, which were loud and brief and left behind a smell. But this, the solid, real, intellectually alive, genuinely good quality of a person whose company she did not have to perform for. She told Claire about him in April, on a Saturday morning call, and Claire's voice went very warm and a little careful in the way it did when she sensed something important. "Do you like him?" Claire asked. "I think I more than like him." "That's wonderful, Nadia." "He's on the list," Nadia said, which came out slightly differently than she intended. And Claire said, after a brief pause, "Good. And is he on the list as well? The human one?" "The human one?" "The one that isn't written down." Nadia looked at the garden outside her window. She said, "I think so." She meant it. She genuinely meant it. And that meaning felt like progress, like arriving somewhere after a very long walk, and she allowed herself to feel it fully, for the first time, in as long as she could remember. Robert came to her flat for dinner in May. She cooked, which she did well and enjoyed, though she would not have led with that piece of information about herself in most contexts. And he brought wine, and they ate at the small table near the window, with the city below in its early summer light. And it was one of those evenings that worked in the way that only evenings with the right person can, where the hours do not announce themselves, and you look up, and it is late, and you are not ready for it to be late. He stayed to help with the dishes, which she had not expected him to offer. He did it without making it a statement, just picked up a cloth and started drying while she washed, and they talked the whole time, and when everything was done and put away, he turned and leaned against the counter, and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely decode, but that made her chest do something complicated. He said, "I think I'm getting very attached to you, Nadia." She looked at him. She thought, say it back, because it was true. It was genuinely true. She was attached to him. She had spent 4 months discovering that she valued his presence, in a way that went beyond evaluation. She said, "I think I'm getting attached to you too." He smiled. It was a slow smile, the kind that started in the eyes. She felt, standing in her kitchen with a damp cloth in her hands, very close to something she had been circling for years. 3 weeks later, he told her that his organization had been offered a funding partnership that required someone to be based in Edinburgh for 18 months. He had been asked to consider it. He was considering it. He told her this on a Wednesday evening, over the phone, in a voice that was honest and a little cautious, and she could hear in the caution that he was aware of what it meant for them, and was bringing it to her as something they might figure out together, rather than a decision he had already made. She was quiet for a moment. She asked questions, practical questions, the kind she was good at. How settled was the decision? Whether there was any flexibility? What 18 months in Edinburgh looked like practically. He answered all of them thoughtfully. He said he hadn't decided anything. He said he wanted to know how she felt about it before he went any further. She appreciated this. She appreciated it enough that what happened next was not inevitable. She wants to be clear about this, looking back, but something in her moved toward the old machinery, without her consciously starting it. The familiar process of analysis, of projection, of measuring the future against a template that had been built when she was 19 years old and had never been substantially revised. Edinburgh was 5 hours. 18 months was 18 months. Long distance in its early stages, when you were still learning each other, when you were still deciding whether this was the kind of thing you wanted to build. That was a complication that required a person who was willing to hold uncertainty with patience. She was patient in most areas of her life. She was patient with manuscripts that needed 6 revisions. She was patient with writers who called at inopportune moments. She was not sure she was patient with love, which was a thing she had always believed should arrive in a form she could recognize and organize. She told Robert that she needed a few days to think. He said, of course. He said, gently, take whatever time you need. She spent those days doing what she always did with difficult things. She worked, she read, she was very present with everything else, and very elsewhere with this. She had dinner with Sophie on the Friday, and Sophie asked, over pasta and a bottle of wine that they finished between them, how things were going with Robert. Nadia said they were going well, but there was a complication. She explained the Edinburgh situation. Sophie listened with her elbows on the table and her chin in her hands. Would you move? Sophie asked. The question surprised her. She had not thought about moving. She had thought about the distance, and the inconvenience, and the 18 months as an obstacle. She had not thought, what if this is worth the inconvenience? I don't know, she said. I hadn't considered it. Interesting, said Sophie. What does that mean? Sophie shrugged, in the casual way of someone who says important things lightly. Just interesting. If it were the right thing, you'd probably have thought of moving first, not last. Nadia looked at her wine. She thought, that is not necessarily true. She thought, practical people think of practical options before they think of dramatic ones. She thought, this is not about not caring enough. She called Robert on Sunday. She told him that she had thought about it carefully, and she cared about him genuinely, and that she also felt that beginning an 18-month long-distance period at the stage they were at would put a pressure on what they were building that she was not sure was fair to either of them. She said she thought it might be better to pause, honestly, rather than try to maintain something across the distance when they were still so new. He did not push back the way Adrian had. He was quiet. Then he said, very evenly, if you're ever less afraid, I think we could have built something very good. She said, I'm not afraid. He said, okay, and his voice was not unkind, but it was a voice that had made its peace. She put the phone down. She sat in her kitchen for a long time. She looked at the table where they had eaten together, the window where the city had been gold in the early summer light. She told herself that she had been responsible, reasonable, that she had simply recognized a genuine logistical problem before it became an emotional one. She did not open the blue notebook that week, or the week after. Sophie did not mention Edinburgh again. Claire, when Nadia told her, went quiet, in the way that meant she was not going to say what she was thinking, and this restraint, which Nadia had always appreciated, now felt for the first time like a kind of sadness. The summer arrived like it always did, regardless of what you had lost, or decided, or filed neatly away. The roses in her mother's garden bloomed again, and Gloria took photographs of them, and sent them to Nadia with no comment, the way mothers communicate the things they cannot bring themselves to say. Nadia looked at the photographs. She thought the roses were beautiful. She thought that every year they came back exactly the same, and every year they were still called beautiful, and she had always found this simple and good. She was 23 years old. She had time. She had a list. She had a job she was good at, and a city she had made her own, and the knowledge, settled like certainty at the center of her, that the right person was still out there, waiting to be found or stumbled upon, or recognized in a bookshop or a dinner party, or on some ordinary morning that would become extraordinary. She had to trust the process. She had always been good at trusting the process. She poured a glass of water and stood at her kitchen window and watched the street below, people moving in the ordinary directions of ordinary evenings. And she felt nothing specific, which she would later understand was itself something worth noting. But she was not later, yet. She was now. She was 23, and she had time, and she trusted the process, and she was fine. The autumn of that year was busy, in a way that felt like mercy. The publishing house was going through a period of expansion, taking on more titles, bringing in new voices, and Nadia was in the middle of it. She had 3 manuscripts in various stages of editing, 2 of which were on tight deadlines, and the work consumed her days with the satisfying totality that good work always did. She arrived early and stayed late, and came home with her mind still running at a low hum of professional thought. And this was fine. This was, in fact, what she preferred. She met a man named Simon Calloway in October, at an event her friend Ruth organized, to mark the launch of a new cultural magazine. Simon was a journalist, widely published, with the kind of easy confidence that came from spending years in rooms where people listened to you. He was 40, which was older than anyone she had previously considered, and when he introduced himself, she noted this fact, and let it sit without making a decision. He was not handsome in any conventional arrangement, but he was extraordinarily compelling to talk to, the kind of person whose attention, when it landed on you, felt like being stepped into a spotlight. He was interested in her. He made this clear, with the directness of a man who had stopped pretending to be casual about things he wanted. He said, at the end of the evening, that he would like to have lunch with her. She had lunch with him the following week. He was fascinating, and he knew it, which was both the most attractive and the most problematic thing about him. And she felt this tension clearly, as she sat across from him in a restaurant he had obviously chosen with great care. He asked her questions with genuine appetite. He told stories with the precision of a person for whom language was a professional instrument. He was interested in her ideas, not her appearance, her ideas, and he engaged with them in a way that made the conversation feel like sparring, and she did not mind that at all. He asked her to dinner after lunch. She went to dinner. Dinner became a habit for 6 weeks. She enjoyed his company more than she had enjoyed almost anyone's. He was not on the list, not entirely. The age gap sat uncomfortably, and there were things about his life that were complicated, in ways she did not want to get into. A marriage that had ended badly, and left certain edges still sharp, but she found herself going anyway, which was unusual for her. What ended it was not a decision she made so much as a truth she arrived at. She liked Simon enormously. She could happily spend evenings with him for the foreseeable future, but she did not feel, in the times between the evenings, the particular private quality of missing someone, the involuntary thought of them that appeared in the middle of an ordinary task. She thought about their conversations often. She did not think about him. She ended it one evening at the end of November, over coffee after dinner, and he received it with the grace of a man who had been through enough to know how to hold a disappointment without falling apart. He said, "I think you'll find him, Nadia. I hope when you do, you won't have made him too impossible to be." She looked at him. She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Only that we sometimes build the idea of what we want so carefully that the actual person can't fit inside it." She drove home turning that over. She thought he might be projecting. He was a journalist. They had a habit of making everything a story. But the sentence stayed with her the way the other sentences had been staying with her recently, stacking quietly in a back room of her mind. December came. She went home to her mother's for Christmas, where her younger sister Patience, 20 years old, studying nursing, with a boyfriend named Aaron, who drove a sensible car and brought chocolates every time he came to the house, sat across from Nadia at the dinner table and said, during a pause in conversation that was perhaps a beat too long, "Is there anyone new?" "No," said Nadia. "Is there anyone old?" "No." Gloria moved food from one dish to another and said nothing. Patience nodded in the way of someone filing information. "You should come out with me and my friends more. Aaron has a friend, actually." "I am fine," said Nadia, which came out more firmly than she intended. Patience raised both hands in a gesture of peace, and the subject was dropped. Later that night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Nadia sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea that went cold while she was thinking, and she thought about all the men she had met in the years since the list began. She did not count them in the dramatic way. She was not that kind of person. But she thought about them in aggregate, the shape of it, the pattern. She noticed that each one had had real qualities. None of them had been nothing. William had built things and listened with his full attention. Robert had been steady and genuinely kind. Even Simon, complicated and too old, had shown her what it felt like to be engaged by an equal. Each of them had been set aside for a reason that felt sound at the time. She sat with this for a while. Then she washed her cup, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. She slept well. She was not troubled by the thought. She simply noted it, the way she noted things, and moved on. But the new year, when it arrived, felt different somehow. Not darker, just different, like a room where the furniture has not been moved but the light has shifted, and nothing is where it used to feel like it was. She was 24 now, a new year, a clean calendar, and the list in the blue notebook unchanged since she had last looked at it. She had no reason to change it. It was a good list. 25 arrived, and something in the social air shifted, not loudly, but in the way a room changes temperature when someone opens a window in a different part of the house. Nadia was aware of it before she could name it. It was in the frequency of questions at family gatherings, in the quality of silence that followed her answers, in the particular way that people who loved her smiled when she said she was doing well. Her cousin Maggie got engaged in January to a man named Peter, who was an electrician from Nottingham, and who was, by general agreement, an excellent person. Steady, attentive, funny, in the easy way of someone who was not trying to be funny. The engagement dinner was warm and full, and Nadia sat at the long table in Maggie's parents' dining room and felt genuine happiness for Maggie, because Maggie was one of those people the world needed more of, and she deserved every good thing. But she also sat with something underneath the happiness, something she could not quite name. That was not envy exactly. It was not about Peter, who was wonderful but also someone Nadia would never have chosen, but was something quieter and more interior than envy. She thought about it on the drive home and decided it was simply the natural slight sadness of watching other people's timelines move forward when yours was, for the moment, still. There was nothing unusual about this. It did not require investigation. In March, she met a man named Christopher Lane at a conference. Christopher was 31, a senior editor at a rival publishing house in London, and she had been aware of his work before she knew his face. His house had published 3 of the authors she most admired, and this gave him a quality of pre-existing interest before he had said a single word to her. He was medium height, she noted this. It was the only item on the list she felt slightly disappointed by, though she immediately told herself she was not going to be ridiculous about height. With sharp, alert eyes, and the manner of someone who made decisions quickly and stood behind them. He approached her at the conference dinner on the first evening and said, without preamble, "Your piece in the Quarterly last month about debut fiction was the best thing I've read in that publication in 2 years." She looked at him. "You read the Quarterly?" "I read everything." "Do you say that to everyone?" "Only when I mean it." She appreciated this. The directness, the lack of social performance. They talked for the rest of the evening, and the conversation had that particular quality she found rare and irreplaceable. The kind where you are not managing what you say, but simply saying it, because the other person is keeping up, and adding to it, and making it better, and the whole thing moves forward with its own momentum. They exchanged details. He texted the next day. Within a month they had established a rhythm of calls and meetings in London. She went down on weekends or he came up, and the distance was navigable in a way that Edinburgh had never felt, and she was aware that this was further than she had let most men get, and she examined this awareness with her usual careful attention, but could not find a reason to pull back. Christopher was on the list in almost every way. He was educated and serious, and professionally formidable. He came from a good family, not old money, but the kind of family that valued learning, and produced people who did things with their learning, which Nadia considered more interesting than inherited wealth. He was not tall enough, but she had decided she was going to be mature about height. He read everything. He had opinions that were not performances. He talked about his work, with the passion of someone who had chosen it fully, rather than fallen into it. And he looked at her, when they talked, with the kind of attention that made her feel that she was the most interesting person in any room she entered, which was exactly what she had written, years ago, in the notebook. She sat with this for several weeks without announcing it. Not to Claire, who was now pregnant with her first child, and busy with the particular fullness of that. Not to Sophie, who had recently moved to Manchester with Callum, and whose life had rearranged itself around him. in a way that was entirely voluntary, and which Sophie described with a lightness that Nadia found simultaneously touching and slightly alien. Not to her mother, she sat with it privately, examined it from every angle, the way she approached a good manuscript, slowly, respecting the weight of it. By June, she had decided she was falling in love with him. She had never said that before. Not about George, not about Adrian, not about Robert. She had liked and respected and admired and found compelling. She had not used the word love, which was a word she did not deploy lightly, because she had always felt that deploying it lightly was the beginning of deploying it incorrectly. She told Christopher on a Saturday evening when they were sitting in her flat with the windows open and the summer noise of the city coming up from below, and she told him simply and directly, which was the only way she knew how to say things that mattered. He looked at her for a moment. His expression was warm and serious at once. He said, "I think I might be getting there too." Not, "I love you." Not the mirror of what she had given him. Getting there. She heard it. She did not make a thing of it. She smiled and moved the conversation elsewhere, and the evening went on beautifully. And she told herself that people arrived at feelings at different speeds, and that he was a measured person, like her, and that measured people said measured things. This was reasonable. This was completely reasonable. The next 3 months were good ones. They were the longest stretch of consistent happiness she had had with any man, and she was aware of this in the careful, cataloging way she was aware of most things. They traveled together in August to Scotland, not Edinburgh, another part, a wild coast she had never been to, and she stood on a beach with him in the wind, with the sea throwing itself at the rocks below, and felt, for a few days, entirely unguarded. It was not a feeling she was used to. She was not sure she trusted it completely, but it was there, and it was genuine, and when they drove back to the city she held it carefully, in the way you carry something you do not want to break. In October, Christopher told her he had been offered the top editorial role at his publishing house. It was a significant step up. It came with considerable demands, more hours, more travel, more of his attention belonging to the job, and less available elsewhere. He told her with a pride he was trying to keep measured, because he was that kind of person, but it was obvious, and she was glad for him. She asked how it would change things for them. He said he expected it would be intensive for a while, at least for the first year. He said he was committed to making time for her, but he wanted to be honest, that the time might look different. He said this straightforwardly, which she appreciated. She said she appreciated the honesty, and that she supported him, and that they would figure it out. And they tried. They genuinely tried. But by December the calls were shorter and the visits fewer, and when they were together he was present but also slightly elsewhere. The part of him that was thinking about work occupying the same room, without quite taking up space she could see. She did not feel neglected exactly. She felt, and she turned this over for a long time before she could find the word, she felt approximate, as though she were not the main thing but a good and valued thing, in a life that had a main thing, and the main thing was his work. She knew this was perhaps unfair. She knew that she also had a main thing. She knew that two people with main things could still build a life together, that it was in fact a good problem to have. Two people who cared about their work and brought that energy to each other. She knew this intellectually. But she also noticed that the unguarded feeling, the beach in Scotland feeling, had not come back since October, and she was not sure whether that was the new schedule, or the accumulation of months, or something subtler that she could not yet name. Christmas came. She went to her mother's again. Patience, who was now in her second year of nursing, brought Aaron, who had graduated from bringing chocolates to bringing a very good bottle of wine, which Gloria received with visible approval. The dinner was warm. Maggie announced she was pregnant. There were the appropriate celebrations, the appropriate warmth, the particular family texture of a table full of people who belonged to each other. Gloria sat beside Nadia after dinner, while the others watched something on television in the other room, and she said, quietly and without looking at her, "How is Christopher?" "He's good," Nadia said. "Busy." "And how are you?" "I'm good." Gloria folded her hands in her lap. She said, after a moment, "You are always good, Nadia. You have always been good. But I watch you sometimes, and I think good is covering something else." Nadia looked at her mother. She thought about the question. She wanted to say, "I don't know what you mean," but she had always been honest with herself. if not always with others, and she knew exactly what her mother meant, and the honesty of it sat in her chest like something cold. "I'm just being careful," she said. Gloria said, "I know you are, child." She said it very gently, and she did not say another word about it, and the television murmured from the other room, and outside, the night was cold, and the street was still, and Nadia sat with her hands around a cup of cooling tea, and thought, "I am always careful. I am the most careful person I know." She did not know yet that careful, when it is applied to everything including love, stops being a virtue, and becomes a kind of closed door. She would not know this for a while longer. She had time. She was 25. She had time, and she had the list, and she had the certainty that she knew what she was doing. The new year opened with Christopher in full professional ascent, and Nadia watching it from a respectful and increasingly unspecific distance. She continued to work. She continued to be very good at what she did. Francis's second novel came out in February and received reviews that were everything they had worked for, and Nadia sat with the book in her hands on the day she received her advance copy and felt a clean, uncomplicated pride that required nothing from anyone else to feel complete. She noticed, without wanting to, that this was the feeling she felt most reliably, the work feeling, the "I built something good" feeling. It was not that love and work were competing, she had never framed it that way, but she was beginning to understand, dimly, that the feeling she felt from work came without risk. It came without the particular vulnerability of investing in another person, and waiting to see what they did with the investment. She and Christopher talked less, not dramatically, not with anyone defining conversation. There was no argument, no breach, nothing she could point to as a cause. The contact simply thinned the way water thins when you add more water, until one day you looked at it, and it was not what it had been, and you could not trace the specific moment of change. In March, Nadia was the one who said it out loud. She did it on a Sunday call, and she did it without performance, because neither of them were performers. She said she thought the momentum had gone out of what they had, and she did not think this was fixable with the current shape of their lives, and she thought it was better to name it honestly than to let it drift. He agreed. He was sorry. So was she. She thought, and still thinks, that he had been a good and real presence in her life, and she does not count that time as a failure. But it was an ending. She put the phone down and sat with the silence of the flat around her, which was a silence she had cultivated and was comfortable in, and which now felt, for the first time, like a specific kind of quiet, rather than simply quiet. She poured a glass of water. She stood at the window. She watched a couple on the street below walking a dog together, one of them laughing at something, the other leaning in to hear it. She looked at them for exactly the amount of time it took to understand what she was looking at, and then she moved away from the window and went back to work. The spring came, in the way spring always came, to a city she loved, with light and noise, and the particular sense of things opening. She read new manuscripts, and found two she believed in deeply, and fought for them at the acquisitions meeting, with the calm, precise authority that she had spent years building, and she won both. She went to a dinner party in April, and met a couple of interesting people, and had a genuinely good evening. She booked a holiday to Portugal for June, alone, which she had not done since her early 20s, and she bought a novel for the beach, and looked at the photographs of the place online, and felt a genuine anticipation that had nothing to do with anyone else. She was 25, going on 26. She had a career she loved. She had a flat that was hers. She had friends she would walk across the city for, and a mother she called twice a week, and a sense of herself that was clear and solid, and not borrowed from anyone. She was not unhappy. She wants to be clear about this, because it matters. She was not unhappy. She was, though, beginning to be aware of a sound, very low and very distant, that she could not stop hearing if she let herself stay still for too long. It was not a sad sound. She could not describe it as sad. It was more the sound of something she had not yet found the name for, occupying a room in her life that she had always assumed would eventually be filled. She had started the Portugal holiday packing list when she received a text from a number she did not have saved. The text said, "I hope you don't mind this. I heard about you through a friend, and I would very much like to take you to dinner. My name is Oliver Nash." She read it twice. She thought, "I don't have time for this." she thought, but she looked it up, because she was always careful. She found enough, through a quick search, to know he was real, had a name that existed in the world with a modest but genuine reputation attached to it, and had a mutual connection in Ruth, who she called immediately. Ruth said, "Oh, Oliver. He's lovely, Nadia. He's really quite lovely. I would have made the introduction myself, but I didn't know if you were seeing someone." "I'm not," Nadia said. "Then have dinner with the man. You have nothing to lose." She sat with the text for a day. Then she replied. She said she did not mind, and she would be happy to have dinner. His reply came within the hour, direct, warm, a suggested restaurant, a suggested date, and a small observation about the restaurant that told her he had chosen it thoughtfully, rather than obviously. She said yes to all of it. She put the phone down and went back to the packing list. She noticed that she was slightly looking forward to it. This was not a common feeling in the lead-up to a first meeting, which she had long since stopped approaching with anything resembling excitement. She had approached them with fair-mindedness and appropriate caution, and had always thought this was the correct approach. But she was slightly looking forward to this one, and she noticed the slight, and she did not try to reduce it. She left it there, small and unexamined. It was the most honest thing she had done in months. A small, unexamined thing. She left it there, and it did not ask her to do anything with it. For now, that was enough. Oliver Nash arrived at the restaurant before her, which she noted. She always noted who arrived first, because it told her something about the kind of person she was meeting. People who arrived late told you they were comfortable making others wait. People who arrived exactly on time told you they were controlled. People who arrived early told you they were either anxious or respectful, and she had learned to tell the difference by watching them when they did not know they were being watched yet. Oliver was standing outside the restaurant when her taxi pulled up, not pacing, not on his phone, simply standing, with his hands in his coat pockets, and watching the street with the calm expression of someone who was comfortable in his own company. He saw her, and his face did something that she could only describe as an honest thing, not a practiced smile, but the involuntary kind that happens before you have decided how to present yourself. He was 34. She knew this from Ruth. He was not exceptionally tall, perhaps 2 or 3 inches more than her, which she accepted as sufficient, and he had the kind of face that would never be described as striking in a first glance, but that became increasingly interesting the more you looked at it. He had clearly spent time outdoors, in the kind of life that leaves a mark. His jacket was good, but not expensive. He shook her hand and said, "I'm very glad you agreed to this." She said, "So am I think." He laughed. It was an easy laugh, the kind that came from the middle of him rather than the surface. They went inside. The restaurant was exactly right, not flashy, not trying to impress, just a place that took food seriously and left you enough room to talk. He had ordered sparkling water already, and there was a glass for her, and she appreciated this small thing without saying so. He told her he ran a small company that designed and built sustainable housing projects. Not architecture exactly, more the intersection of design, materials, and land, he explained, with the careful phrasing of someone who had explained his work many times and had learned to say it in a way that was honest rather than impressive. He cared about it, she could tell immediately. Not in the performative way Adrian had cared about his work, not in the polished way Christopher had, but in the quiet, settled way of someone who had found their correct occupation and spent their days inside it, without wondering if there was something better. He asked about her work with the genuine curiosity of someone who read and understood why books mattered. Not as cultural objects, but as actual experiences, the kind that changed the shape of how you understood things. And she found herself talking about it more openly than she usually did. More specifically, because he kept asking the right questions, and the right questions made you say things you had not planned to say. He was not on the list in every way. He was not from a particularly distinguished family. He mentioned his parents with warmth, a teacher, and a builder from the north of England, and there was nothing in his background that would make a name turn heads in a room. His company was successful, but not on a scale that produced profiles in business publications. He was not the kind of handsome that she had always imagined. She noticed all of this. She noticed something else too, which was that she was noticing the list failures less than she usually did, and noticing him more. He said something about his last project, a housing development on the outskirts of Bristol that had taken 4 years and run into problems she could tell had been serious. and he talked about the problems without minimizing them, and without the particular performance of suffering that some people do when they want you to know they have been through difficult things. He just said, "It was hard, and this is how we got through it, and I learned these things." That was all. She found it compelling in a way she could not immediately categorize. They stayed at the table for 3 hours. The restaurant filled and emptied around them. She drank 2 glasses of wine, and he had one, and they ate well and talked the whole time, and it was one of those evenings that feel like a gift at the time, though you do not yet know the full weight of what has been given. He walked her to the taxi rank afterward, because the evening was mild, and they were both in no hurry. At the taxi stand, he turned to her and said, "Can I ask you something direct?" "You can ask," she said. "Did this go as well as I thought it did?" She looked at him. She appreciated the directness so much that she was direct back. "Yes," she said. "I think it did." He smiled, the involuntary kind again. "I'd like to see you again." She said she would like that too. In the taxi home, she sat with the evening and turned it over, trying to locate the familiar analytical machinery, the checklist testing she always did after a promising first meeting. She found it, but it felt slightly further from the front of her mind than usual. She had to reach back for it somewhat. She ran Oliver through it, and he passed most things and did not pass others, and she thought about what not passing certain things actually meant, in terms of what the rest of the evening had felt like, and found that the calculation did not come out the way it usually did. She was not sure what to do with this. She did what she usually did with things she was not sure what to do with. She did not do anything immediately. She waited. She watched. She would see him again and gather more information, and then she would know. She saw him again the following Thursday, then the Thursday after. In the 3rd week they went to an exhibition. Not his choice or hers, but something neither of them had planned. They just found themselves walking past and going in, and they stood in front of a piece of photography that neither of them could decide how to feel about. And he said something about it that made her turn to look at him, with an expression she could not control. And he saw the expression, and raised his eyebrows and said, "What?" And she said, "That was a remarkably good observation." And he said, "You didn't expect a good observation?" And she said, "Honestly, I didn't expect that particular one." And they stood there in the quiet gallery for a moment that felt slightly held, the way some moments do. She had told Claire about him by the 4th week. Claire was 8 months pregnant and somewhat enormous and magnificently happy, and she listened to the description of Oliver, with her hands resting on her stomach and her eyes attentive. "He doesn't tick every box," Nadia said. "No," said Claire. "But does he feel like the right person?" Nadia thought about this honestly. "He feels like a real person," she said. "And I'm not sure how to describe the difference, but there is one." "I know the difference," said Claire. She said it quietly, and with the weight of someone who did. Oliver, for his part, was consistent in a way she had not entirely expected. He did not flood her with attention or perform elaborate gestures. He showed up when he said he would, and called when he said he would, and was exactly the same in the 3rd month as he had been in the 1st, which was a quality she was beginning to understand she valued more than she had ever written into any list. They went to his flat once. He lived simply, in a clean and organized space with a wall of books and a kitchen he clearly used, and plants that were alive and well-maintained, which told her something, and they cooked together, which was not something she had done with anyone. It worked better than she expected. He was not precious in the kitchen. He was competent and unbothered about the messier parts of cooking, and she found herself more relaxed than she was used to being in someone else's space. Afterward, they sat with wine, and she told him about the list. She did not plan to. It came out during a conversation about what it meant to know what you wanted in life, and she told him, with a slight self-awareness she could hear in her own voice, about the blue notebook, about the years of careful measurement, about the proposals and the decisions. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "And where am I on the list?" She said, "Honestly?" He said, "Yes. You pass most of it and not all of it." He considered this. He did not look wounded. He said, "What do I fail?" She said, "The family name thing, and the height, technically, though I'm aware how that sounds." He smiled. "Not dramatically tall. No. And the name, my family is not distinguished. No." He nodded slowly. He said, "Can I tell you something? Please." The list sounds like it was built to protect you from something. I don't know what, but that's what it sounds like. She sat with this. Her first instinct was to push back, because she did not like being analyzed, and she was always aware of when she was being analyzed. But she sat with it instead of pushing, and she thought about Simon saying she might make the person too impossible to be, and she thought about Robert saying, "If you're ever less afraid," and she thought about what Claire had said about the human list, the unwritten one. She said, "What do you think it's protecting me from?" He said, "I don't know you well enough yet to say, but I think you know." She did not answer right away. The quiet in the flat was comfortable. Outside, the city did its ordinary things. She said, after a long pause, "I think I'm afraid of needing someone." He looked at her with a steadiness that she felt in the center of her. He said, "That's a very honest thing to say." She said, "I'm usually honest." "I know," he said. "It's one of the things I like most about you." She drove home that night in a taxi, with the city going dark around her, and the conversation still alive in her chest. She sat with the afraid of needing observation, which had come out of her before she had fully formed it, and she thought about whether it was true. She thought it was probably true. She did not know what to do with that yet. She was not sure she was ready to do anything with it. But it was out there now, said into the air of his flat and absorbed into the evening, and she could not take it back, and she was not sure she wanted to. The blue notebook sat on her desk at home, where it always sat. She walked past it when she came in, and did not pick it up. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought, what am I actually afraid of? She did not answer the question, but she asked it, which was more than she had done before. The city outside her window was quiet. The question stayed in the room with her, patient, waiting for an answer she was not yet ready to give. Spring moved into its deepest version of itself, and she and Oliver continued to see each other in the comfortable, undemanding way that felt, she realized, like nothing she had experienced before. Not because it was more exciting, it was not, particularly, in the surface sense, because it required nothing from her that she was not willing to give. There was no performance in it. She did not arrive at his door having adjusted herself, having taken the parts of herself that felt too large or too direct or too certain, and quietly reduced them so they would fit more politely in the space they shared. She was exactly herself, and he was exactly himself, and the two selves sat together without either one requiring the other to be something else. She noticed this so slowly that by the time she fully understood what she was noticing, it was already 3 months in. She also noticed that she was not measuring him against the list anymore, not because she had made a decision to stop. She had not made a decision. The measuring had simply become less urgent, the way a habit becomes less urgent when you realize the thing it was protecting you from is not as threatening as you believed. She told nobody this, not even Claire, though Claire was now 6 weeks into new motherhood and incandescent with exhaustion and love, and would have been delighted to hear it. She sat with it privately, the way she sat with most important things, because she was a private person in the deepest parts of herself. And she turned it over, and she tested it from different angles, and she thought, this is what it feels like when you stop building a wall long enough to let someone see what's behind it. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was not supposed to be comfortable. That was, she was beginning to understand, the entire point. She had always thought that the right feeling would be clean and certain, that she would meet the right person and know immediately, with the same clarity she felt when she found a manuscript worth fighting for. Clean recognition, no mess, no uncertainty. What she felt with Oliver was different. It was more like she spent a long time looking for the right word. More like trust that was being built one day at a time, in small and unglamorous increments. It was not the feeling of recognition. It was the feeling of choosing, actively, consciously, daily choosing to let someone further in, and finding that the further in they got, the less frightening the closeness became. This was not what the blue notebook had prepared her for, but it was real. She picked up the notebook one evening in late May. She had not opened it in months. She opened it now and read the list from beginning to end, slowly, the way you read something you wrote a long time ago that you need to understand differently. She did not tear the page out. She did not cross anything off. She read it, and then closed the notebook and set it down, and sat for a long time. Then she opened a new page and wrote one sentence. She wrote, The right person is not a solution to anything. He is someone you choose to be honest with, and who chooses the same. She closed the notebook. She put it back on the desk. She called Oliver, because she suddenly wanted to hear his voice, and he answered on the third ring and said, "Hey, you." And his voice was warm and unhurried, and she said, "I was just thinking about you." And he said, "Good thoughts?" And she said, "Yes," and meant it all the way down. They talked for an hour. When she put the phone down, she sat in the quiet of her flat and thought about the sentence she had written, and about what it had taken. How many years, how many proposals, how many very careful decisions, to arrive at a truth that simple. She was 26. She had arrived at it earlier than she might have, she supposed, and later than she could have. But she had arrived, and it felt, standing in her kitchen in the quiet May evening, like being somewhere she should have been heading all along. Outside, a bird she could not see was making a sound that filled the whole street. She stood and listened to it for a moment before she went back inside. It was a small, ordinary evening, in a life that was finally beginning to feel less like something she was constructing, and more like something she was actually living. The difference, she thought, was enormous. The difference was everything. The thing about a wall is that you do not always know it is there until you are trying to let someone through it. Nadia had spent years being the kind of person who was easy to admire and difficult to get close to. She would not have described herself this way, because she was genuinely warm, genuinely interested in people, genuinely present in conversations. But there is a difference between being interested in people and being available to them, and she had always managed this boundary with the precision of someone who had reasons for it that went deeper than she was prepared to look. Oliver was the first person who made her aware of the wall, not by fighting it or criticizing it, but by being so consistently on the other side of it, calm and unhurried, that she could not pretend she did not see it too. It started to become clear in July. They had been seeing each other for 4 months. The relationship had a quality she found both reassuring and slightly disorienting. It had become her life in the small ways that matter, the Thursday evenings, the Sunday morning calls, the particular habit of turning to him mentally when she had news, good or difficult, before she had decided she was going to. These were not large things. They were the small domestic stitches that hold two people into each other's dailiness, and she found them, to her surprise, comfortable rather than constricting. But July brought a week when Oliver went quiet. Not cold, not in any way she could point to, but the specific quality of his presence shifted, became slightly more interior. He was dealing with something at work, she knew. A project had run into a serious funding problem, and a key collaborator had withdrawn, and there were urgent decisions to be made. He told her this briefly, in the way he told her about difficult things, without performance. He said he would need a focused couple of weeks to deal with it. She said of course. She said she understood. And she did. Intellectually she did. But what happened in the following 2 weeks was something she had not anticipated. The slight reduction in contact, fewer calls, shorter texts, one canceled plan, activated something in her that she did not recognize immediately. A tightness, a low, persistent readiness, like the way a body holds itself before impact. She found herself checking her phone more often than she meant to. She found herself, twice, composing texts and then deleting them, because they were the kind of texts you send when you are trying to manage the anxiety of not hearing from someone. And she knew that, and she did not want to be that person. She wanted to be the person who understood that people had hard weeks. She was, normally, absolutely that person. With everyone else in her life she was. With her authors who disappeared into revision tunnels and emerged weeks later without apology. With Sophie, who sometimes went a month without calling when things got intense in Manchester. With her mother, who sometimes processed difficult things by going very quiet for a week. But with Oliver, the quiet felt like something different. The quiet felt like information. Which was the problem? Which was, she was starting to understand, the whole problem. She was treating his temporary withdrawal the way she always treated things, as data to be analyzed, as a sign to be read, as a reason to evaluate whether this was viable. And the analyzing and reading and evaluating was itself a kind of withdrawal, a way of pulling back before she could be pulled away from, a way of getting ahead of a hurt that had not happened and might not happen at all. She sat with this on a Friday evening, in the second week of his quiet, with a glass of wine she had poured, but not drunk, and a manuscript she had opened, but not read, and she thought, I am doing the wall thing. I can feel myself doing the wall thing, and I am watching myself do it, and I am not stopping. She called Claire. Claire answered on the second ring, with the particular pre-voice sound of someone who has been half asleep, which at 9 in the evening, with a 6-week-old baby, was entirely reasonable. Nadia apologized immediately for the hour, and Claire said, don't be ridiculous, give me 1 second, and Nadia could hear the small sounds of careful movement, and then the baby, briefly, and then Claire's voice from somewhere quiet. Tell me, Claire said. Nadia told her. She told her about the 2 weeks, about the tightness, about watching herself analyze rather than simply feel. She told it in the careful, ordered way she told things, and when she had finished, there was a brief silence from Claire's end that was not uncomfortable. Claire said, Can I ask you something and you won't get defensive? I'll try. Why do you think Oliver going quiet for 2 weeks about a work crisis feels like danger to you? Nadia opened her mouth to give the reasonable answer. The reasonable answer was that she had been through enough relationships that thinned out over time to have learned to recognize the early signs. The reasonable answer was that she was simply being perceptive rather than paranoid. The reasonable answer was that 2 weeks of less contact was an objective data point. She heard herself about to give the reasonable answer, and she stopped. She sat quietly for a moment. She said, Because if I let myself fully want this, and it goes wrong, I won't know how to handle that. Claire did not say anything for a few seconds. When she spoke, her voice was very gentle. She said, Nadia, that's just love. That's what love does to people. Nadia looked at the wine she had not drunk. She said, I know. You've been protecting yourself from that particular risk for a long time. I know. And it has cost you some real things. This landed. She let it land, rather than redirecting it. She said, very quietly, Yes, I think it has. Claire said, Oliver sounds like someone worth the risk. Nadia said, He is. I think he genuinely is. Then stop analyzing him, and let him come back from a hard week without making it a decision. She exhaled. She said, That simple? That terrifying, Claire corrected. And yes, that simple. They talked for a few more minutes about other things. The baby, who was apparently developing opinions about sleep schedules, and Paul, who was being magnificent and slightly bewildered, as new fathers often are. And then Claire said she needed to go, and Nadia thanked her, and they hung up. She looked at the wine. She drank it. She closed the manuscript and put it on the desk, and turned on something on television that she did not pay attention to, and sat with the conversation in the way she was learning to sit with things she could not immediately organize. Oliver called on Sunday. He said the project crisis was not resolved, but he could see the shape of a resolution, which was enough. He asked how she was. She said she was fine. She was about to say fine and leave it at that, the abbreviated, armored version of fine that she had given people for years without knowing she was doing it. And then she did not. She said, Actually, I had a weird 2 weeks. I want to tell you about it when we see each other. There was something in the pause that followed that she felt rather than heard. He said, Good weird or bad weird? Instructive, she said. He said, Then I definitely want to hear it. They met on Tuesday. She told him about the tightness and the deleted texts and the analyzing and the wall. She told it without performing it, without making it more significant than it was, or less significant than it was. She was as plain and honest as she knew how to be. He listened with the full attention thing. The thing she had first noticed about him at the restaurant on the night they met. When she finished, he said, Thank you for telling me. She said, I'm not fully through it yet. The wall thing. I'm working on it. He said, I know. I can see you working on it. That's actually the part I find remarkable about you. She looked at him. Which part exactly? He said, That you're honest about it rather than pretending it isn't there. She thought about all the times she had not been honest about it. The proposals, the decisions, the careful retreats in the direction of a list that made sense on paper. She thought about William saying, I thought we were building the path as we went. She thought about Robert saying, if you're ever less afraid. She thought about her mother saying, careful is covering something else. She thought, they all saw it. They all saw it before I did. I've wasted some time on the wall, she said. Oliver looked at her with the steady quality that she had noticed from the beginning. He said, "You learned something from the time. That's not wasted." She thought, "That is possibly the kindest thing anyone has said to me in years." She did not say this out loud, but she held it, and the holding felt like something opening rather than closing. They stayed late into the evening, talking about the project, and about her work, and about a trip he wanted to take in the autumn, to somewhere she had never been. She said she might like to come, if he was asking. He said he was asking. She said all right then, and that was how they made their first plan together that belonged to the future. The unwritten future, the one she had been too careful to look at for years. She drove home in the dark with the window down, because the night was warm, and she thought, "I have been building toward this for longer than I knew." She thought, "And I almost didn't get here." She thought, "But I am here, and that is what matters." The city moved around her in its ordinary Saturday night life, people walking and talking, and living the particular unremarkable fullness of real lives, and she was among them, and it felt, for the first time in a long time, exactly right. The autumn trip Oliver had mentioned became a real plan by August. He wanted to go to the coast of Portugal. She had booked that solo trip and canceled it the previous spring, and when she mentioned this, he said, "Then let's go," with the ease of someone for whom going is not a complicated decision. She arranged a week off work, which her editor-in-chief approved with the particular smile of a woman who had been watching Nadia work too hard for too long, and was glad to see evidence of a life beyond manuscripts. They flew out on a Friday morning in late September. She had packed the novel she had always meant to read on that beach. She had also packed, she noticed, nothing from the blue notebook. She had left it at home on the desk, and the leaving felt deliberate, though she had not made a production of it. Portugal in autumn was golden and unhurried. They stayed in a small house she had found, near enough to the sea that they could hear it from the windows at night. They cooked together most evenings. Oliver was better in a kitchen than she had expected, and he was not competitive about it, which she appreciated, and they ate outside when the evenings allowed it, and they talked about the kinds of things you only talk about when you have enough quiet around you. He told her about the business he had built from nothing at 26, just himself and a second-hand truck, and a reputation he had built one project at a time. He told it matter-of-factly, not as a story of triumph, but as the account of a person who had worked, and it was one of the most compelling things he had said to her, not because of what he had built, though that was real, because of how he talked about it, as something he had done, not something he was. She told him about her father. She had not talked about her father with anyone she was dating since the early years, when she had understood that you could share too much too soon, and make people feel as though they were being handed a debt. She talked about Patrick Okafor, who had been a warm and funny and quietly bookish man, who had told her she would do things most people only read about, and who had died when she was 11, and left a shape in her life that was not sadness exactly, but a particular quality of absence she had learned to live around. She told Oliver this. She said it plainly, without drama. He listened. He did not say he was sorry, in the reflexive way people often did. He said, after a moment, "Do you think that's part of it, the carefulness about people?" She looked at the sea. She said, "I've thought about that. And? I think when the most important man in your early life leaves without warning, you learn to keep a hand on the exit, even in situations where there's no exit." He was quiet. She could feel him thinking, not performing thought but actually doing it. He said, "That makes enormous sense." She said, "It's not an excuse." He said, "It's not an excuse, and it's not nothing either." She looked at him. The sea was doing its unhurried thing behind him, and the sky had gone the particular orange of a late Algarve afternoon, and she thought, this is what it feels like when someone holds the true thing about you, without either minimizing it or making it a project. She said, "I don't want to keep the hand on the exit with you." He looked at her steadily. He said, "Good, because I'm not planning to leave." He said it simply, the way he said most things, and it landed simply, and she did not move away from it. She let it be said. She let it stay said. That evening, over a dinner they had made together, and a wine she had chosen without consulting anyone, she thought about the list in the blue notebook. She thought about 19-year-old Nadia, sitting at the small wooden desk by the window, writing down what she believed a man should be. She felt, thinking about her, a tenderness that surprised her, not contempt for the list, not embarrassment. Tenderness, because that girl had been trying to protect something. She had been trying to make herself safe in the only way she knew how, which was by controlling the future, by building specifications that would guarantee she never ended up with the wrong thing. What she had not understood then, what she was only now fully understanding, was that the future cannot be specified. It can only be moved through, with as much honesty and courage as you can carry. The sea outside was very dark now, and the lights of the house were warm, and Oliver was washing up the dishes in the kitchen, and she could hear him through the open window. Some song he was humming that she did not recognize, and the sound was one of the most ordinary sounds in the world, and it made her feel something she was finally ready to call what it was. She was happy. Not the managed, functional happiness of a productive life well organized. She was actually, presently, right now happy, in the specific and irreplaceable way that only happens when you stop keeping yourself at a careful distance from your own life. She called her mother the next morning, early, while Oliver was still asleep. She sat outside with coffee and the sea in front of her, and the air cool and salt-sharp. Gloria answered on the second ring. Nadia said, "Good morning, Mum." Gloria said, "Morning, child." "Are you all right?" Nadia said, "I think I'm very all right, actually." She could hear, down the phone line, her mother's breathing change very slightly. The way it does when you have been waiting for something for a long time, and you hear the first note of it. Gloria said, "Tell me then." And Nadia told her. She told her about Portugal and Oliver and the conversation by the sea. She told her without editing, without organizing it into the neat shape she would have presented to anyone else. She told it the way it was, which was warm and complicated and true and hers. When she finished, Gloria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have been waiting a long time to hear you talk about someone like this." Nadia said, "I know." Gloria said, "You sound like yourself." Nadia thought about this. She thought, "I have always been myself." But she understood what her mother meant. She sounded like herself, without the armor on. She said, "I think I might be learning to." The sea in front of her was morning light pale, and enormous, and entirely indifferent to everything that had just been decided, which was a quality of the sea she found deeply and specifically comforting. She stayed on the phone with her mother for another 20 minutes, until Oliver appeared in the doorway, with 2 more cups of coffee, and a look on his face that asked if she needed privacy, and she shook her head, and held out her hand for the cup, and he handed it to her, and sat down beside her, and she thought, this is it. Not what I imagined, better than what I imagined. The sea kept going, the morning light kept changing, and she sat in it, with her coffee, and her mother's voice, and the man beside her, and felt the wall, very quietly, continue to come down. The morning they came back from Portugal, Nadia's mother called. She had not called. She had been called by Nadia, the previous week, from the terrace, with the coffee and the sea, and the man sitting beside her. But now she was calling, and she was calling at 7 in the morning, before the taxi home from the airport, and Nadia felt something change in her chest before she answered. Gloria's voice was steady. Her voice was always steady, which was the thing about her mother's voice that told you nothing on the surface and everything underneath, because you had to learn to hear the quality of the steadiness, and Nadia had lived with it her whole life. "Your Uncle Patrick has had a fall," Gloria said. Not her father, her uncle, her father's brother, who was 68 and lived alone in the house in Wolverhampton, where Nadia's father had grown up. She had not been close to him as a child. He was a reserved man, not unfriendly, but economical, with connection, in the way that certain men of his generation were. But she had grown closer to him in her adulthood, partly because he had her father's eyes, and her father's particular way of pausing before he spoke. He had fallen in the night. He had been found in the morning by a neighbor who had not seen him collect his post. He was in hospital. He was going to be all right, the doctor had said, but he was not going to be all right immediately. There was a hip involved, and a night on the floor, and he was 68, and lived alone, and certain things were going to need to be reconsidered. Nadia sat in the taxi with Oliver beside her, and her bag at her feet, still wearing the light jacket she had worn to the airport in the Algarve warmth that was entirely wrong for an English October morning, and she looked at the motorway through the window and thought about her Uncle Patrick's eyes. She told Oliver what had happened in the spare way she told him things. He listened. He said, "What do you need to do?" She said, "I need to go to Wolverhampton." He said, "Of course. Do you want company?" She thought about it for a moment, which was unusual. She was a person who said no to offers of help before she had considered them. From practice, if nothing else. She said, "I think I need to go alone first, but thank you." He nodded. He asked no further questions. She went to Wolverhampton that afternoon. Her Uncle Patrick was in a ward that smelled of the particular institutional cleanliness of hospitals, and he was lying in a bed that made him look smaller than she remembered, which always happened with people you knew when you saw them horizontal. And his face, when he saw her, came alive in a way that made her throat tight. "You didn't need to come," he said. "I wanted to," she said, and she meant it. She sat with him for 3 hours. She brought him the things the nurse had suggested, a phone charger, a book, some decent biscuits because the hospital ones were, he said, an insult to biscuits. He talked, more than he usually did. She thought it was the particular loosening that comes when a person has had a fright and is safe now and is grateful enough to let their guard down. He talked about her father, about the two of them as boys in that house in Wolverhampton, the things they had got up to, the kind of trouble that was the harmless, remembered with love kind. He talked about her father's quietness, and his wit, and the way he had of seeing the important thing in any situation before anyone else had found it. She listened. She asked questions. She held the image of her father, young and alive in that house she had visited as a child, and she felt it settle into her the way grief sometimes does, not with pain but with a weight that was also a kind of fullness, a having had something, rather than a losing of it. She drove back in the dark. She called her mother. She called Oliver. She went home. Over the next 2 months, the shape of her life changed, in the slow, undramatic way that real change tends to arrive. Her Uncle Patrick came home from the hospital on a modified plan. He had care visits now, and grab rails in the bathroom, and his neighbor was more formally involved in his daily life. But it was clear that he needed more than the arrangement could provide, and the question of what that more looked like fell, as these questions tend to fall, to the person in the family best equipped to organize things. Nadia organized things. She was, as she had always been, excellent at this. She researched options, asked the right questions, visited twice more before the end of October to see for herself how he was managing. She coordinated with her mother, who came up from Coventry twice as well. She updated her sister Patience, who was doing long shifts at the hospital and could not easily get away, but who sent money toward the care costs without being asked, which was the kind of gesture that made Nadia feel very clearly how much she loved her sister. What the 2 months also did was give Nadia a particular kind of visibility into something she had not seen clearly before. She watched herself managing her uncle's situation, and she watched herself managing her relationship with Oliver, and she noticed that in the first, she was entirely unself-conscious, fully present, unguarded. She did what was needed without calculation. She was not afraid of being needed. She was not afraid of the weight of responsibility. She was not afraid of the emotional cost of sitting at a hospital bed for 3 hours and letting herself be moved by an old man's memories of her father. But she had been afraid, for years, of exactly that kind of being moved in any personal relationship. She had organized her romantic life with a precision she had never applied to any other part of herself, and she had believed the precision was discernment, and now she was starting to understand that it was something else. Oliver came to Wolverhampton with her in November, on a visit she had initially said she would do alone. She had been saying she would do it alone, and then one Sunday morning, she had looked at him across the table with coffee between them and said, "Do you want to come on Thursday?" And he had said yes, without asking any clarifying questions. Her Uncle Patrick met Oliver with the particular economy of an older man who does not perform warmth, but whose face tells you everything you need to know. He looked Oliver over with the eyes her father had given him, and he said, "You work with buildings." "I do," said Oliver. "My brother built things too," Patrick said. "Not buildings. Other kinds of things." He looked at Nadia when he said this, and she held the look, and she did not look away. On the drive home, Oliver said, "He's a good man." She said, "He is." He said, "He loved your father very much." She said, "Yes." Oliver looked at the road. He said, I would have liked to meet your father. She thought about the kind of statement that was. She thought about the forward-looking quality of it, the way it placed Oliver in a relationship with her history, rather than just her present, and she felt, in her chest, the particular warmth of being known. She said, I think he would have liked you. She meant it. And meaning it felt like something arriving that she had been waiting for a long time, longer than she had known she was waiting, since she was 11 years old, and the most important man in her life had left without warning, and she had built, very carefully, very quietly, a way of making sure that no one would ever again be important enough to leave a hole that large. She had been so careful, she had been so entirely, perfectly, precisely careful. And she was so tired of it. She did not say this to Oliver in the car. She thought it, clearly and completely, while the motorway went past, and she felt something release very slightly in the middle of her, not dramatically, not with any announcement. Just a small, necessary letting go of something she had been holding for many years. She reached across and put her hand on his on the gear shift, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they drove the rest of the way home without saying anything that needed to be said. Her mother called that evening. Nadia was making tea, and Oliver was reading on the sofa. He had started leaving things at her flat without making an event of it. A book here, a jacket there, small accretions of ordinary presence. And she answered, and her mother asked how the visit had gone. Nadia said, it was a good visit. Gloria said, he took to Oliver? Nadia said, Uncle Patrick doesn't take to anyone in under 6 months. Gloria said, Patrick Sr. would have liked him. That's what I meant. Nadia was quiet for a moment. She said, I know, Mum. Gloria said, you sound like yourself again. And Nadia, who had heard this before from her mother, and had not known what to do with it, now understood exactly what it meant. She said, I'm working on it. She was. She genuinely, daily was. December came, and with it all the particular textures of December. The cold streets made warm by lights, the end-of-year quality of things, the sense of accounts being settled and taken stock of. Nadia had a busy month at work and a social calendar that was full in the way she liked, with people she actually wanted to see, rather than appearances she had decided to maintain. She went to Claire's baby's first Christmas gathering on the 17th, a Saturday afternoon at Claire's house in London, and she stood in the warm, slightly chaotic domesticity of that small home, the baby on the rug being regarded very seriously by Claire's elderly cat, Paul in the kitchen wearing an apron he was somehow making look dignified, Claire glowing in the way of someone who had found exactly the life she wanted, and she thought, this. She thought, I used to look at this and feel slightly separate from it, as though it were a world I was observing from a respectful distance, and now she did not feel that. She felt entirely inside it. She held the baby while Claire made more tea. The baby looked at her with the solemn, evaluating expression of a person who had been in the world for approximately 1 year, and was reserving judgment. She looked back and thought, you are very small, and you know absolutely nothing, and I find you entirely wonderful. She said this out loud, quietly. The baby appeared to consider it. Claire appeared in the doorway with the tea, and saw Nadia's face, and said, you look good, Nadia. Nadia said, I feel good. Claire sat beside her on the sofa. She said, tell me about Oliver. He's good, Nadia said. He's very good. Are you happy? She did not hesitate. Yes. Claire smiled. It was the smile of someone who had been hoping to hear this for a while, and was now hearing it, and was glad. She said, the list? Nadia said, still in the notebook, with a new sentence added that says something about choosing to be honest. Claire said, progress. Enormous progress, Nadia agreed. Glacial, but enormous. They laughed at the same time, the particular laughter of two people who have been honest with each other for long enough that honesty has become a form of warmth. The year ended quietly. She spent Christmas at her mother's. Oliver came for 2 of the days, and was easy in the house in the way she had hoped he would be, and Gloria made the particular effort with food that was her most genuine language of approval. And there was a moment on Christmas afternoon when she looked across the table and saw Oliver talking to her sister Patience about something, gesturing with his fork, engaged, entirely natural, and Patience was laughing, and her mother was watching from the kitchen doorway, with an expression that said everything her mother rarely said out loud. Nadia held the image for a moment. She thought, "This is the thing I almost managed not to have." Not because there was anything wrong with her, not because she had been foolish or deluded, but because she had spent so many years building a structure to protect herself from the risk of being hurt, that she had accidentally built something that kept out the other thing too. The warmth, the dailiness, the irreplaceable particular mess and grace of another person living alongside you. She had been afraid, and the fear had been understandable, and the fear had also cost her things she was only now able to name. She raised her glass at the table and thought, "Better late than not at all." She thought, "And it is not even late. It is exactly the right time." Because that is, she was beginning to understand, how it always works. Not the time you planned for, not the timeline you arranged in a blue notebook. The actual time. The one that arrives when you are ready, and not a moment before, and which would not have been the same time earlier, because you would not have been the same person. She had needed to be this person. This woman who had been through the proposals, and the careful decisions, and the wall, and the conversations by the sea, and the hospital bed, and the drive home, with someone's hand in hers. She had needed to be all of that in order to be here, at this table, at this Christmas, present, in a way she had not been before. It was not wasted time. It was the time it took. The new year arrived the way New Years do, with noise and light and the particular human insistence on meaning found in the turning of a calendar. She sat beside Oliver at a gathering of friends, his friends and hers, the two circles beginning to overlap in the organic way of two lives genuinely combining. And when midnight came, he turned to her in the noise and the light, and she looked at his face and thought, "I chose this. After all of it, I chose this. And it chose me." She kissed him once, just once, briefly, with the noise of everyone around them. She was 26 years old, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She thought, the lesson was never about waiting for the perfect man. She thought, the lesson was about being willing to be a real person with an imperfect, wonderful, genuinely present one. She had learned it. It had taken time. But she had learned it, and it was sitting in her chest now, solid and warm, and nothing like fear. Nothing like fear at all. The noise died down around them. Somewhere across the room someone was singing, badly and enthusiastically, the kind of singing that happens when people are very happy and don't care what they sound like. She thought, that is actually exactly the right way to sing. She thought, I have been very careful for a very long time about what I sound like. She was not going to do that anymore. 27 arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, and Nadia celebrated it in the way she now celebrated things, without excessive planning, with the people who mattered, in a way that felt like her life, rather than an occasion borrowed from what she thought her life should look like. Oliver had asked, a week before, what she wanted to do. She had said she wanted dinner with him and Claire and a few others, somewhere comfortable, and good food, and an early night, because she had a big submission to finish by Friday. He had arranged exactly this, which was the kind of quietly attentive thing he did, without making an announcement about it. She arrived at the restaurant to find Claire already there, and Sophie, who had come down from Manchester with Callum, and Ruth from work, and two of Oliver's friends, who she had grown genuinely fond of over the previous months. 9 people, a good table, an evening that moved the way good evenings move when they are full of people who are glad to be there. At some point in the middle of it, she sat back from the conversation and looked at the table. She was not doing this consciously at first. She was simply, for a moment, seeing the room rather than being in it. She saw Oliver at the other end of the table, telling some story she had already heard, that was still making her smile because of how he told it. She saw Claire laughing at something Paul had said, their hands on the table close to each other, in the easy way of two people who have stopped tracking the distance. She saw Sophie leaning into Callum's shoulder, with the relaxed certainty of someone who has stopped performing and started actually living. She thought, I almost missed all of this, not the dinner, the feeling inside the dinner. She thought, I spent so many years being certain I knew what I was looking for, that I nearly walked past everything that was actually here. Then Oliver looked up from his story, and found her across the table, and she looked back, and something passed between them, that was not dramatic, and was not nothing, the particular ordinary private language, of two people who have become each other's. She picked up her glass. She turned back to the conversation. She was not sad about the years. She had examined the years many times now, with an honesty she had not always been capable of, and she was not sad about them. She had needed to be exactly herself at every stage of it. The 19-year-old with the blue notebook, the 22-year-old who said no to George with such clean certainty, the 24-year-old who ended things with Robert and convinced herself she had been practical, the 26-year-old sitting on a terrace in Portugal saying, "I am afraid of needing someone." Each version of herself had been real. None of them had been wrong. They had each been doing exactly what they were capable of at the time. The thing she could not have told the younger versions, the thing that would have been useless to try, was that the list was not the problem. The list was a symptom. The problem was that she had believed that wanting the right person was the same as being ready for a real person. These were not the same thing. Being ready for a real person required being willing to be real yourself, to put down the organizing structures and the careful distances, and stand in the actual weather of someone else's life, without an umbrella. She had learned this. It had taken time. She was not ashamed of the time. The year that followed her 27th birthday was one of the fullest she had known. Fullness, not in the sense of being busy. She had always been busy, but in the sense of actual substance, of days that contained things worth remembering. Her work went very well. She was commissioned to write a piece about debut fiction for a literary magazine, her first piece of writing to appear under her own name, rather than through her work. And the response it received told her something about the possibility of a wider public voice that she had not previously considered. Frances's third novel came in, and it was the best thing Frances had written, and Nadia read it in 2 evenings, and called Frances on the second one to tell her. And Frances cried again. And Nadia found this no less moving for the repetition. Oliver's project situation stabilized and then improved. The housing development he had been working on for 4 years opened in the spring, and she went with him and stood in the street outside what had been an empty brownfield site and was now a row of houses that were well designed and well built and being moved into by people who needed them. And she watched his face as he looked at the thing he had made, and she thought, "I know you." She thought, "I know what this costs you to do, and I know what it gives you, and I know the specific quality of satisfaction on your face right now." She knew him, in the real, accumulative, small and large way of knowing someone, not in the way of the list. The list had been about knowing what kind of man she wanted in the abstract. This was knowing this specific man, this particular person with his particular history, and his particular way of listening, and his particular stubbornness about certain things, and his particular gentleness about certain others. The difference was everything. In June, her sister Patience called with the particular tone of voice that precedes significant news, and Nadia sat down without knowing she was going to, and waited. Patience said she was pregnant. Aaron was the father. They were, she said, both terrified and very happy. She said the last part slightly louder than the first, as though to make sure Nadia heard which one was winning. Nadia said, "That is wonderful, Patience. That is genuinely, completely wonderful." Patience exhaled. She said, "I thought you might have notes." Nadia said, "I have no notes. I have only happiness." She heard Patience smile down the phone. She thought, "I have not always been this easy to tell things to." She thought, "I am glad to be becoming someone easier to tell things to." Their mother, when she heard, made a sound on the phone that was somewhere between crying and laughing, and that Nadia had never heard from her before. And she thought, there is always more to know about a person, even the person you have known longest. She and Oliver went to Coventry for a family dinner in July, an evening that was warm and slightly chaotic in the best way, with Patience and Aaron at the table, and Gloria moving in and out of the kitchen, and the particular noise of a family that was in good health and knew it. Oliver sat at the table with the ease of someone who had found his footing somewhere, and Nadia watched him talking to Aaron about, of all things, building materials. And Aaron was an electrician, and had sensible things to say about buildings. And the two of them were engaged in a conversation that she had not arranged, and that did not require her to manage. She thought, this is what it looks like when someone becomes part of your life, because they actually fit it. Not because you engineered the fit, not because they met a set of criteria, because you let them in, and they stayed, and the staying turned out to be as natural as anything. Gloria found her in the kitchen between courses, ostensibly helping with the serving plates, and she said, quietly, because she had always said the most important things quietly, "I like him very much, Nadia." Nadia said, "I know. So do I." Gloria looked at her with the full attention thing that Nadia had inherited. She said, "Your father would have liked him too." Nadia held this. She did not look away from it or redirect it or file it quickly away. She held it and let it mean what it meant. She said, "I know, Mum." She said, "I've been thinking about that a lot, actually." Gloria said, "I'm glad." They went back to the table together. The evening continued. Aaron told a story about an electrician he had worked with, who was afraid of light switches, which made no logical sense, and was extremely funny. And Patience laughed until she made a sound that surprised even her. And Oliver's face was the face of a man who was very much where he wanted to be. Nadia looked at all of them. She thought, "I have been given this. Not found it, given it. By life, which had been patient enough to wait while she figured out what she was actually afraid of, and then, when she finally began to set that down, brought her to a table like this one." She picked up her fork. She ate her dinner. She was in the room, entirely. Not managing it from a slight distance, not watching from behind the careful glass of her own certainty. She was there, fully, and at last. And the fairness felt like the most important thing she had done in 27 years. The autumn of that year brought something she had not seen coming, which was fitting, because the things that matter most rarely announce themselves. She had been working with a new author, a man named Daniel Osei, who had been referred to her by Francis, which was how the best things sometimes arrived, one good thing leading to another. Daniel wrote fiction that did something unusual with time, looping and layering the way memory actually works, rather than the neat linear way most fiction pretended it worked. And his manuscript had come to her in August, with a covering note from Francis that said simply, "This one is real, treat it carefully." She had read it in 4 days, which was 2 days slower than she needed to be for her actual schedule, and did not feel like a sacrifice. She had begun working with Daniel in September, and the editing was the most engaged she had felt about a piece of work in years, perhaps ever. Not because the book was easy, it was demanding. It required her to think in ways her training had not fully prepared her for, to hold the whole of something in her head while examining the parts. But because demanding work done with the right material is not a burden, it is a pleasure of the highest order. She told Oliver about it one evening, and he listened with his full attention thing. And when she had finished describing the structure of the book and why it worked, despite appearing not to, he said, "That sounds like how you think, like how you actually process things." She looked at him. She said, "Say more about that." He said, "You don't think in straight lines. You never have. You think in circles that get smaller until they find the center of something." She sat with this. She thought, "That is one of the most accurate descriptions of my mind that anyone has offered." She thought, "And you have been watching me long enough to see it." She said, "Is that strange to live with?" He said, "It's one of my favorite things about you." She looked at him and thought about all the versions of herself she had brought to the years before this one, the measured, list-holding, strategically careful versions. And she thought, none of them would have believed that someone could know her this well and not use the knowledge to manage her. She had spent so long expecting people to use what they knew about her as leverage, as strategy, as a way of getting something, that when someone simply used it to love her better, she had not known at first how to receive it. She was learning how to receive it. She thought that was perhaps the most important learning of the whole period. Not what to want, not how to choose, but how to receive the good thing when it arrived. In October she was invited to speak at a conference, not the publishing kind, a broader kind, about women in professional life, and the particular navigation required to be both excellent and human, in a world that sometimes wanted you to be only one at a time. She said yes because the subject mattered to her, and she spent 3 weeks preparing the talk. And when she stood at the lectern and looked out at the room, she felt, for perhaps the first time in front of a large audience, entirely unself-conscious. She said the things she had actually come to believe, rather than the things she thought would land best, which is a distinction that feels small and is enormous. She talked about the wall. Not in those terms. She did not say, "I built a wall," because that was her private language for her private experience. But she talked about the way that professional women were often trained to manage themselves as assets, rather than to know themselves as people, and about how this habit, when it crossed over into personal life, produced women who were very impressive and somewhat unavailable to their own actual happiness. The room was quiet, in the way rooms get quiet when people recognize themselves. She said, "The list you keep of what you deserve is not the same as being willing to receive it." Someone in the third row wrote something down. She thought, "I needed to say that." And saying it confirmed that I have arrived somewhere real. After the conference, she had a drink with one of the other speakers, a woman named Catherine who ran a medical practice and had 3 children, and wore her experience of all of this like a comfortable coat. And Catherine said, "That bit about receiving. How long did that take you to learn?" Nadia said, "About 7 years." Catherine said, "That's actually quite fast." Nadia looked at her. She said, "Is it?" Catherine said, "Most people take 15. Some take forever." Nadia thought about this on the drive home. 7 years since the blue notebook, since George and his mother's house, since Adrian's confidence and Robert's Edinburgh and William's Path as We Go, since Christopher's ascending career and the wall and the deleted texts, and Oliver in the taxi saying, "Of course, what do you need?" 7 years. She had a different relationship to those years now than she had had even 6 months ago. They were not a source of any sadness. They were simply the distance it had taken. She had needed to cover all of it to be standing exactly here, which was 30, not 27. She had lost track of the telling. She was a woman in her late 20s, and it does not matter whether it was 27 or 28, it was now, and she was standing exactly here, which was complete. Not finished, not arrived at some final destination, complete in the sense of being fully present in a life that was hers, with work she believed in, and people she loved, and a man who knew her in the real way, and chose her in the daily way, and had never once tried to make her smaller, so that she would fit. She drove home through a city that was hers. She thought about the list. She thought about the 19-year-old who had made it, and the years it had taken to understand what it really was. She thought, the list was not wrong. The list was a beginning. The beginning of asking the question, even if the question was asked in the wrong form. The right form of the question, she knew now, was not, what should he look like? Where should he be from? What should he have built? The right form was, can I be real with this person? Can he be real with me? Are we choosing each other, daily, in the ordinary and unglamorous way that is the actual substance of love? The answer with Oliver was yes, had been yes from the first dinner, though she had needed months to let herself trust the yes. She parked outside her flat. She sat in the car for a moment, just sitting, not thinking anything in particular, just being in the evening, in the city, in her life. She went inside. Oliver was reading on the sofa. He looked up when she came in. She sat down beside him, and he put his arm around her in the easy way of someone who had learned where she fit, and she put her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that, in the quiet of the flat. She thought, this is what I was looking for. Not him specifically. She could not have described him before she found him. But this quality of quiet, and real, and chosen, and present. She had found it. She closed her eyes. The city did its ordinary evening things outside the window. She was home. Outside the window, the city did its ordinary evening things. Inside, 2 people sat in quiet, and neither of them needed anything other than what they had. That, she thought, was the whole lesson. That was all of it. No more complicated than that, and no less hard to arrive at. The winter Patience's baby was born, was the coldest winter Nadia could remember in years. The kind that arrived in November and refused to leave, that covered the city in a gray, that was not unpleasant exactly, but was very firmly itself. She drove to the hospital on a Wednesday morning when Patience called, and she stood in the corridor outside the ward for a few minutes, before she was allowed in, and she stood very still in that corridor, and felt, without preparing for the feeling, an emotion she could not immediately name. She thought about it, waiting. She thought, it is not nervousness. It is not sadness. It is the particular weight of a life turning, the same weight she had felt at her Uncle Patrick's bedside, at Claire's dinner table with the baby on the rug, in the car, after Oliver said I'm not planning to leave. It was the weight of things being real, of life, insisting on its realness, refusing the distance she had historically preferred. She was allowed in. She stood at the door of the room. Patience was in the bed, and Aaron was beside her, and between them was a person who was 20 minutes old, and already had an expression of tremendous concentration, as though she had arrived in the world and was immediately assessing it. Nadia walked in. She said hello to Aaron, who was crying in the uncomplicated way of a person who had no complicated feelings about crying, and she said hello to Patience, who looked simultaneously like she had run a marathon and won it, and then she looked at the baby. The baby was named Rosa, which was decided before she arrived. Rosa Okafor Mensa, after Aaron's grandmother, and she had Aaron's forehead and Patience's eyes, and she was entirely herself, which all new people are, regardless of whose foreheads and eyes they carry. Nadia held her. She had held other people's babies before, Claire's, and before Claire several others at various intervals, but she held Rosa with a quality of attention that was different, because this was her family's baby, her blood's continuation, and the smallness and weight of her was specific and irreplaceable. She thought, holding her, I almost organized myself out of wanting this. I almost made myself so precise in my requirements that I would have arrived at 35, still waiting for the correct circumstances to allow myself to be in a life. She had not. She was here. Rosa made a sound that was not quite crying, and not quite contentment, but something in between, the particular language of a person who has just arrived and is not yet sure how to communicate. Nadia held her closer and said something soft, and the baby looked at her with those new eyes, and Nadia thought, you are going to be a person. You are going to have a whole life full of decisions and feelings and things you get right and things you get wrong and people who see you and people who don't, and I am going to be your aunt, and that is something I am enormously glad to be. She drove home from the hospital in the early afternoon. Oliver was working from home that day, and he met her at the door with tea, because she had texted him from the car park, and he had clocked that tea was needed. He handed it to her, and she took it, and sat down, and told him about Rosa, about the 20 minutes old, and the enormous concentration, and the sound that was not quite crying. He sat across from her and listened, and when she had finished, he said, "How are you doing?" She said, "I'm good. I'm really good." And then, which surprised her, "I'm also thinking about things." He said, "What kind of things?" She said, "The future kind." He looked at her with the steadiness she had come to rely on. "The way you rely on a fixed point when you need to navigate," he said. "I think about those too." She said, "What do you think?" He said, "I think I want all of it with you. I've thought that for a while. I didn't want to say it before you were ready to hear it." She looked at him. She thought, he has been sitting on this, patiently, without pressure, waiting for me to arrive at the place where I could receive it. He had known she needed to arrive rather than be brought, and he had let her arrive. She said, "I think I'm ready to hear it." He said, "Good." And he smiled, the involuntary kind. "So let's start talking about it." They did not make any decisions that day. They did not make any decisions that day. They talked, which was what they were good at, and the talking felt like the beginning of planning, in the way that all real planning begins. Not with logistics, but with two people deciding that they are building something together, and that they would both like to see what it becomes. She told her mother that evening. Gloria said, very quietly, "I'm glad, Nadia. I'm very glad." She told Claire on a call the following Saturday morning. Claire was feeding the baby, and slightly sleep-deprived, and entirely lit up at the news. She said, "It's about time you let someone build something with you." "I know," Nadia said. "He's good for you." "He is, and I think I'm good for him." "I know you are," said Claire. "I've watched you two. You're good for each other in the real way, not the impressive from the outside way. The actual way." Nadia thought about the impressive from the outside way. She thought about how much time she had spent, in her younger years, evaluating things for how they appeared, rather than what they were. The list had been, in part, about appearance. A man with a name, a man with a distinguished background, a man whose presence in her life would make a particular kind of sense to the world looking on. She had wanted love to be legible, to read clearly as the right choice. What she understood now was that the most important things are rarely the most legible. They are the things you only fully see when you stop caring about how they look from the outside and start paying attention to how they feel from the inside. Oliver looked, from the outside, like a perfectly decent man who ran a building company and was not exceptionally tall. He had not one thing on the list that had impressed anyone at a first description, Her Aunt Dorothy, upon hearing about him, the teacher and builder parents, the sustainable housing company, the northern roots, had said, in the plainly concerned way of someone who believes they are being helpful, "That's it? After all those years?" Nadia had looked at Dorothy and said, "Yes, that's it." She had not said it with sharpness. She had said it with the particular peace of someone who had found an answer, and no longer needed anyone else to confirm it. Dorothy had changed the subject. That was all right. Not everyone was ready to understand what they had not personally lived. The winter deepened. She and Oliver spent the run-up to Christmas making plans, not the spectacular kind, not decisions that would look impressive in the telling, but the real kind. Plans that required both of them to adjust, to consider the other's life alongside their own, to think in the first-person plural in a way she had always found slightly frightening and now found, to her own amazement, entirely natural. They talked about living together. Not where or when exactly, but that they wanted to. She had lived alone for several years and she had loved it, genuinely, and she was not giving up her aloneness but choosing a different configuration of it, which was a distinction that mattered. He felt the same. He said he had never moved in with anyone for the wrong reason, and he was not going to start now, which she found reassuring, in the way that people who are careful about things for good reasons are reassuring. Her Uncle Patrick came to Coventry for Christmas, for the first time in several years, because the care arrangement had stabilized enough that he could travel with some assistance, and Patience brought Rosa, who was 6 weeks old, and even smaller than Nadia remembered, and the house was full, in a way it had not been full since her father was alive. She sat at the table with all of them, and Oliver beside her, and she looked at her Uncle Patrick's face, which had her father's eyes, and she thought about Patrick Okafor, who had told her she would do things most people only read about. She thought, I wonder what he would say about the life I chose. She thought, I think he would not say anything at first. He would look at Oliver. He would watch the way Oliver was at the table. He would ask 1 or 2 careful questions and listen to the answers. And then, later, when they were alone, he would say something quiet and specific that contained everything he meant. Like her mother. Like Patience, when she was not being direct. Like all the people who loved her, who had seen things she was not yet ready to see, and had waited, without giving up, for her to come around. She had come around. It had taken what it took, and the coming around had been hers, not given to her, not performed for her, not the result of someone convincing her. She had done it herself, one small piece at a time, one careful letting go after another, until she was standing where she was standing. She looked down the table at Rosa in Patience's arms and thought, you are going to make a list one day. You are going to decide what you want, who you want, how things should look. You are going to be very certain, and some of your certainty will be right, and some of it will be a wall, and the work of your life will be figuring out which is which. She thought, I will be here. When you are figuring that out, I will be here, and I will not tell you what to do, and I will wait. Because that, she had learned, was what love actually looked like, not instruction. Not the certain knowledge of what was best. Just, I will be here, and I will wait, and when you are ready I will still be here. Oliver refilled her glass without being asked, which was one of the small things that added up to something enormous. She thanked him. He smiled. Her mother, across the table, was watching this, with the expression she now wore when she watched them together, which was a kind of settled gladness that was its own eloquence. Outside the window, the first snow of the winter was beginning to fall, very lightly, in no hurry. The city was softening under it. It was a good evening. It was a completely, unremarkably, specifically good evening, and she was in it, and she did not watch it from a distance, and she did not hold any part of herself back from it. She was there. That was everything. She had learned this. There are 2 ways to live. One is to stand at a slight remove, organizing your experience from behind a careful glass, safe from the impact of things. The other is to be in it, fully, with no guarantee of how it will go, without the protection of the right criteria, or the perfect conditions, or the list that promises you will not be left with your hand on an exit that was not supposed to be there. She had chosen the first way for a very long time. She had been very good at it. She had been, in fact, extraordinarily good at it, in the way that people are extraordinarily good at the things they have practiced the longest. She was learning the second way. It was not easier. It was not supposed to be easier. It was supposed to be real, and it was. Every morning she woke up and chose it again, and some mornings it felt entirely natural, and some mornings it felt like courage, and she thought both of those were correct. She had talked to a therapist now, for 6 months, a woman named Dr. Patricia Lowe, who was quiet and precise, and who had said, in their 3rd session, something that had stayed with Nadia in the way things stay when they are exactly right. You have been protecting yourself from your father's death by never letting anyone else become indispensable. The problem with this is that indispensable is exactly what love requires. She had sat with that sentence for weeks. She still sat with it sometimes. Not because she had not worked through it. She had worked through it, carefully and honestly, the way she worked through everything. But because it was one of those true sentences you return to, the way you return to certain books, not because you need to relearn what they say, but because revisiting them confirms where you are. She was not the woman who had protected herself from her father's death by never letting anyone become indispensable. She was still in the process of not being that woman, which was different from having arrived at the opposite, but the process was real, and it was ongoing, and she was not going to stop it. The snow was still falling outside. Oliver reached across the table for the bread and said something to her Uncle Patrick that made her uncle laugh, actually laugh, the genuine kind, which was rare enough from him to feel precious, and she thought, this is the thing I almost did not let myself have. She picked up her fork. She was hungry, which was simple and good. She ate her dinner. The snow fell, and the evening went on, and Rosa slept in Patience's arms, with the absolute peace of someone who has decided, for the moment, that the world is acceptable. The candles on the table had burned down to different heights. Her mother was telling a story about something that had happened to her at the market, and the story was not interesting in any measurable way, but it was told with the warmth of someone who knew her audience, and everyone was listening, and the room was exactly what it was, and nothing more, and nothing less. This is what the lesson looked like when you had learned it. Not a triumph, not a revelation at the end of a long journey, just a table, a family, a man she had chosen, a baby who was new, a mother whose voice she had loved her whole life, snow, outside a window. Just this, just here. She was 28 years old, and she was home. The snow kept falling. She watched it through the window for a moment, the slow, indifferent generosity of it, covering everything equally, the street and the cars and the garden and the bare roses, and she thought about all the winters she had sat in this house, with this woman, who was her mother, and watched snow fall, and how different this winter was from all of those, not because of the snow, which was exactly the same snow, but because of who was sitting beside her. She turned back to the table. She was there. That was it. That was, finally and fully, and in all the ways that mattered, all of it. The blue notebook was still on the desk. She had not moved it. She walked past it every morning, on her way to the kitchen, and every evening on her way to bed, and it sat in the same place it had always sat. Dark blue cover, slightly worn at the corners from years of handling. The list inside unchanged since the night she had sat at 19, and written down what she believed she deserved. She moved in with Oliver in February, not the same house. They found a flat that was new to both of them, a third place that belonged to neither of their histories, which felt important, in a way she had not anticipated. She carried things from her flat to the new one over several weekends, box by box, and on the last trip, she held the blue notebook in her hand for a long moment before she put it in the box. She did not know what she was going to do with it. She was not ready to throw it away. She was not sure she would ever be ready to throw it away, because the girl who had made the list was still part of her, still deserving of the care that comes from being taken seriously, even when you are wrong, even when your wrongness costs you something. She put it in the box. She carried the box to the new flat. She put the notebook on the new desk, in the new room, in the life she was now building with another person in the active, daily, unguarded way that she had always believed in theoretically and had now begun to actually practice. Oliver was there when she arrived with the last box. He had already unpacked most of his things. He was practically organized in the way of someone who does not like chaos in his physical space, and the flat was beginning to look inhabited in the pleasant, slightly tentative way of a new place that does not yet know what it will become. He took the box from her and set it down and looked at her with the question in his expression rather than in words, and she said, I'm good. And she meant it entirely. They had dinner that night in the flat, not eating out to celebrate, just cooking together in the new kitchen that was unfamiliar in all its details. Where the knives were, how the oven behaved, the quality of the light at that time of evening, and finding out about it together, which was a small thing, and was also the whole thing. She set the table, and thought about all the tables she had sat at since the list began. Her mother's table in Coventry, the restaurant tables of first dates with men she had evaluated with care, and let go with certainty. The table in Portugal where she had told Oliver she was afraid of needing someone. The Christmas table with Rosa in Patience's arms, and the snow outside. She thought about all of them, lined up in her memory. A series of ordinary surfaces where real things had happened. She thought, all of that was the path to here. She had never believed that before. She had believed, when she was younger, that the path to here would be straight and purposeful and organized, that it would look, from the outside, like a reasonable sequence. She had not understood that the path was exactly as long as it needed to be, and that you could not skip the parts that were hard or confusing, or that ended in disappointment, because those parts were not detours, they were the path. George, with his mother's house and his pleasant face, had shown her what it felt like to be seen as a suitable candidate rather than a person. Adrian, with his great confidence and his inability to share space, had shown her what it felt like to be in a room with someone who filled it so completely that she might disappear. Robert had shown her what choosing practically rather than truly actually cost. William had said, I thought we were building the path as we went, and she had heard the sentence but not been ready to understand it. Christopher had shown her that two people with enormous professional investment could still lose each other between the lines of their own ambitions. Simon had said she might be building the person too impossible to be, and he had been, as journalists often are, exactly right, in the precise wrong way. And Oliver had arrived in the ordinary way of the thing you were waiting for, without knowing you were waiting for it, and he had been patient, in the way that real patience, not performance patience, but the actual kind, looks exactly like showing up consistently, and without agenda, and letting the other person take the time they take. She had taken her time. She had taken a great deal of it. And now she was here. She put the last fork on the table, and stood back, and looked at the set table in the new kitchen, with the light doing something warm on the wall, and she thought, this is a very ordinary thing. This table, this kitchen, this man in the other room, she thought, and ordinary is not a lesser category. Ordinary, when it is exactly right, is the highest form of anything. She called her mother while the pasta was cooking. Gloria answered with the particular alertness of someone who had learned over many years to receive calls from Nadia with a certain amount of attention, because Nadia's calls tended to contain things worth attending to. Nadia said, "We're in." Gloria said, "How does it feel?" Nadia looked around the new kitchen. She thought about how to say what it felt like. She thought about the blue notebook and the list, and the 19-year-old who had made it, and the 28-year-old who had ended up somewhere the list could never have specified. She said, "It feels like I finally trusted the right thing." Gloria said, "Which was?" Nadia said, "Myself. The actual self, not the organized one." There was a brief silence from her mother's end that was full rather than empty. Gloria said, "Your father would have said that was the only self worth trusting." Nadia said, "I know he would have." She said, "I think I've known that my whole life. I just needed to believe it." They stayed on the phone for a few more minutes. Oliver came into the kitchen, and she pointed to the pasta without interrupting the call, and he nodded and took it from there with the easy competence of someone who is comfortable taking things from there. She watched him move around the new kitchen with the particular satisfaction of watching someone find their footing somewhere they have chosen to be. She ended the call with her mother's voice warm in her ear, and the pasta nearly done, and the flat around her feeling, for the first time, like a place that was becoming hers. She thought about the lesson. Not in those dramatic terms. She was not the kind of person who used phrases like life lesson in her own thinking, without flinching slightly. But she thought about what the years had taught her, and she tried to say it simply, the way she tried to say everything important. The lesson was not that she had been wrong to want what she wanted. She had wanted real things, a man who was genuine, educated, present, kind, interested in the world. These were not impossible things. They were good things to want. The error had not been in the wanting. The error had been in the architecture of the wanting. In building a list of qualities rather than a capacity for connection. In treating love as a standard to be met rather than a risk to be taken. In believing that if she was precise enough in her requirements, love would arrive in a shape she could recognize immediately, comfortably, without having to do anything frightening. Love did not work that way. She knew this now, the way she knew other true things, in the body, not just the head. Love required you to let someone into the parts of yourself that were not polished, not performing, not already decided. It required you to be in the middle of your own uncertainty and let another person see you there. It required, ultimately, the willingness to need someone, which was the one thing she had spent the longest time protecting herself from. She had been afraid of needing someone because the most important person she had ever needed had left when she was 11 years old, and she had not been consulted, and there had been no preparation, and no soft landing, and no list that could have prevented it. She had built the wall after that leaving, not on purpose, not with understanding, but with the instinct of a person who had learned that love at its fullest meant the possibility of a loss at its fullest. She had kept the wall for almost 20 years. She was still learning to live without it. Some mornings she felt it almost entirely gone, thin and translucent, barely there, barely relevant. Other mornings she felt it in some form, some residual caution, some impulse toward distance. She did not think this made her damaged or broken, or particularly unusual. She thought it made her a person who had learned something, and was continuing to learn it. Oliver knew about the wall. She had told him, in pieces, over the months. He did not manage it from a distance, or observe it with clinical interest. He simply stayed. He was present in the way that genuine presence, not possession, not performance, but actual showing up, is the only effective response to a wall. You cannot argue someone out of a wall. You can only demonstrate, daily, that the other side of it is safe. He had done this. She had let him. And the flat they were now in together was the result of that. Not of her finally meeting the man from the list, but of her finally being willing to live a life that was real, rather than arranged. She set the pasta plates on the table. Oliver poured water. They sat down. She thought about saying something that captured all of this, the notebook, the years, the lesson, the arriving, and decided she did not need to. She had said enough, at various points, to the various people who had been there for the various parts of it. She had said it to Claire and her mother and Oliver and, once, to Dr. Patricia Lowe, who had nodded with the particular satisfaction of a therapist watching her work bear fruit. She had said it, in her own way, at the conference. She had said it, most importantly, to herself, in the new kitchen in October, when she stood at the window after getting off the phone with Robert 3 years ago, and watched a couple walking their dog, and understood what she was looking at. She had said enough. She knew what she knew. She ate her pasta. Oliver told her something about the flat next door, the neighbor they had met that morning who had a loudly opinionated cat, and she laughed because it was funny, and because she was sitting across from someone who knew how to tell a small thing so that it landed correctly. Later, after dinner, and the washing up, and an hour on the sofa, reading companionably, in the specific way of two people who like each other very much, and also like books, she went to the desk and picked up the blue notebook. She sat with it in her hands for a moment. Then she opened it to a new page, past the list that was still there unchanged, past the sentence she had added the night she first understood that the list was not enough. She wrote one more sentence. She wrote, "The right person does not complete the list. He makes you understand why you were holding it." She closed the notebook. She set it down on the new desk. She went to bed. Outside the window, the city did what cities do when nobody is watching. Went on quietly with its own business, full and alive and indifferent. The way cities always are, the way the world always is, regardless of what is being decided inside any single life inside it. She turned off the lamp. In the dark, in the new flat, in the life she had chosen honestly, rather than organized perfectly, she was at rest. She had wanted the best. Life had taught her what best actually meant. She had listened. That was the whole story. That was, in the end, every bit of it. The next morning she woke before Oliver, which happens sometimes, and she lay still in the early gray light of the new flat, and listened to the sounds of a place still introducing itself, the particular quiet of it, the quality of the street noise from outside, the different way a new ceiling looks in the first light of morning before you have got used to it. She lay there for a while. She thought about nothing in particular, which was a thing she had rarely done in her life, and was learning to do more of. Just being in the morning, without immediately organizing it. Oliver was asleep beside her, with the deep stillness of someone who sleeps well. She looked at him for a moment, his face in sleep, familiar already and still capable of surprising her, and she thought, I chose you. After all of it, I chose you. Not because you were on the list, because you showed me that the list was a beginning and not an answer. She got up quietly. She put on the robe she had hung on the new hook on the new door. She went to the kitchen and filled the kettle and stood at the window while it boiled and looked at the street below, which was just waking up in the tentative way of early winter mornings. A delivery driver and a woman with a pushchair and a man with a coffee who was moving quickly somewhere. She thought about all of it one more time, with the particular morning clarity of a mind that had just rested. She thought about the 19-year-old and the list. She thought about the proposals and the careful decisions. She thought about the wall and the deleted texts and the terrace in Portugal and the hospital corridor and the snow outside the window at Christmas and Rosa with her tremendous concentration. She thought, I was always going to get here. I was always heading here. It just took the time it took. The kettle clicked off. She made tea. She stood with the cup at the window in the early light, and she was 28 years old, and she was in the right place, and she was not holding herself at a careful distance from any of it. She was, finally and completely, there. The city went on below. The morning opened. She drank her tea. That was all. That was everything. Life had not given her the perfect man. It had given her something better, the wisdom to recognize a real one, and the courage, finally, to let him in.